Hi everyone, hello. We're just about to start here. Thanks, Des. Thank you. So welcome everyone here and online for this two-day event. I'm the Regional Engagement Officer with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I've been working with colleagues from UHI and HIE to bring this programme together for the 2 days of events. So we've had some school events over the programme over the past couple of days, and some events with Professor Alice Roberts, and we're here today for the Friday and Saturday part of the programme. The event is being live streamed and recorded, so there are ample opportunities to enjoy the presentations later at your leisure, and of course we welcome questions from in person and online. So I'll hand over to Professor Des Thompson now, who'll be able to speak a bit more about the programme. Thank you.
Courses with the University of the Highlands and Islands and Highlands and Islands Enterprise to highlight the many facets of scholarship, endeavour and society in the Northern and Western Isles. Now, the UHI is of course very well known to everyone here, but perhaps what will not be so widely appreciated is it operates from more than 70 locations in Scotland. It runs more than 300 courses and has in excess of 40,000 students, which I think is remarkable. And it has 3 bases in Orkney. The Highlands and Islands Enterprise operates over half of Scotland's landmass, working with communities, enterprises and a wide range of stakeholders to unlock the region's potential for growth and progress whilst driving fair work and net zero practices. The Royal Society of Edinburgh is possibly the least well known of the 3 of you here. It's Scotland's National Academy. Its fellowship of 1,800 people is drawn from the most distinguished in their fields of academia, business and the public sector, and it provides independent and expert advice to government and policymakers and seeks to inspire the next generation of innovative thinkers. Now, the RSE was formed in 1783 for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge, and over the ensuing 241 years it sought to actively contribute to social, economic and environmental well-being in Scotland. Now, for those of you with a keen interest in dates, 1783 was the year in which Great Britain recognised the sovereignty of the United States after the American War of Independence, and it was the year in which the world's oldest newspaper was founded. The Herald, formerly known as the Glasgow Herald, is evidently the world's oldest newspaper, founded in the same year as the RSE. Well, listen, I'll stop wittering on history and introduce a genuine historian, Professor Chris Whatley. We've provided detailed biographies at the back of the programme, so I'll not give extensive introductions to everyone. Suffice to say that Chris is one of our most distinguished historians with deep interests in including the history, and his interests have included the histories of the salt industry, the environmental revolution and the poet Robert Burns. Chris, come to the stage.
Right, well, thank you very much, Des. One of the great pleasures of the last... Sorry, sir.
Hearing very well.
You're not hearing very well. Let's see if you can hear better. Oh, God. Right, okay. Can you hear better now? I'll shout. Okay. One of the great pleasures of being involved with this series has been working with Des. I'm an historian, as Des has said, and one of the great things I think about this project is interdisciplinary. I love working with people in other disciplines, and there's too little of it about there, but anyway. So, I'm delighted to be here. I should confess something though, and that is this, and I'm kind of ashamed because I know there's an archaeologist sitting right in front of me here. I have been to Orkney before, and I was with some archaeologists, and of course archaeologists are interested in archaeology and all the archaeology there is on these on Orkney. But after I'd been to about the 4th stone circle, I said, I'm not coming back here again. This is dreadful, because you go to these circles and you have the same story, you know, well, it's this, and this. And it might have looked like this, but we don't quite know why they're here, other than they obviously had some huge significance sometime. But anyway, I sat in the back of the car like a wee huffy boy and said, I'm not getting out for another one. But I did, and I've come back, and it's been great. The flight over this morning was wonderful. I thought we should begin this weekend's serious business, our symposium on Islands Present, by saying something about the context which has inspired the event. There are at least 3 reasons why we've embarked on this Islands series of meetings. The first of which was held in Solmorostig on Skye way back in 2023. Firstly, there is the Royal Society of Edinburgh's current mission, about which Des has said a little bit. But the second reason why we're here in Orkney, and earlier in the year we're on Harris and Lewis, and prior to that Skye, is this, that the islands are a unique feature of the north and west of Scotland, which is the territory Des and I were asked to not conquer, because that'd be there was lots of people here already, but we were asked to involve the RSE with. And not always recognised as there are 800 islands in Scotland. And that's a lot of places. And of course, the Orkney archipelago, as you all know, comprises some 70 islands, which amounts to almost 9% of the Scottish total. In fact, I had a pleasure today, or earlier today, of flying over some of them. This must be Scotland's islands capital, or the capital of Scotland's islands. Anyway, and the third reason we're here, despite their number, is that they're often overlooked, forgotten about even in Scotland. And perhaps the reason is because most of the population of Scotland and the country's main institutions are clustered in the central belt. And that movement of people, of course, is something that's been taking place for the best part of 3 centuries. Now, the islands, of course, are visited, but mainly during the summer months. A winter on the Uists, or indeed the exposed island coasts, anywhere, when the nights are long and the wind blows incessantly and the rain drives in to even the best weather-protected properties, can test the hardiest of souls, both physically and mentally. So visitors' impressions are necessarily partial and fleeting. This, though, hasn't stopped people writing about the islands, but too often by misty-eyed isle journalists and the fair weather travellers I've just mentioned. I don't know if any of you have read Hugh MacDiarmid, or the late Hugh MacDiarmid, on the Scottish islands, but he said this way back in 1939. He had no time for what he called the olla podrida, which translates as Spanish stew, of old wives' tales, day trippers' ecstasies, trite moralisings, mawkish sentimentality, supernatural fantasies, factual spinach, and outrageous banality, which fills the most books on this subject. And in fact, I hesitate to say this, but such books are still being written, and evidently there's a market for them. But happily, we have now many more robust island histories, one of the more recent being Orkney's own Peter Marshall's The Storm's Edge, Life, Death and Magic on the islands of Orkney. Even so, I think it's fair to say that Scotland's islands aren't as well understood as they should be. Happily, this is changing, not least through the research work being done by and through various bodies, including the UHI and its teams of researchers here in Orkney and as well as in Shetland, spearheaded by those involved in the Small Islands Cultures Research Initiative and the Centre for Island Creativity. Indeed, what Des and I have become aware of and inspired by is the sheer volume of research being carried out on the island, in the islands, on the islands, and not always by academics. Communities, as in Ness in Lewis, have and are playing their part in this kind of endeavour. So to cut a long story short, we thought we'd set up this series of 3 events, one looking at the island's past, one looking at the island's present, and now the island's future. And in order to, I think, to set the scene for this session today, I'm going to briefly summarise some of the points that came over in our previous events, with the plan being, or the hope being, that this will either directly or indirectly help to inform the discussions we'll be having today and tomorrow. So the three series should ideally join up. I guess if there was a big take-home point that is as true today as it has been historically, is the observation, and this is pretty banal, I admit, that Scotland's islands are very different from one another. Sure, what they have in common is that they're surrounded on all sides by the sea. Yes, many are similar, but there's also a huge variation in size, from skerries on the one hand on the one extreme, if you like, to enormous land masses on the other. Some are mountainous. Others, some are fertile, others less so. Orkney is of the former, the green fields which I passed over this morning, wonderful and sought after beef and lamb, looks very different from, say, Lewis in the Outer Hebrides and much of Skye with their vast acres of moorland and peat, and in the case of Skye, of course, the massive Cuillin Mountains. Now, another point that's come across quite powerfully in our previous sessions is that how we look at a map of Scotland has in large part determined how we see and interpret the significance of Scotland's islands. Now, many of you will be aware of this point, but looked at traditionally, they are on the left and at the top, although in the case of Shetland, not always at the top, when it's relocated to a box alongside Orkney, or maybe even transplanted into the North Sea, although this happens less nowadays. But from this perspective, they're peripheral, far from the centres of power like Glasgow and Edinburgh and London. Yet you turn the map on the side, and coming from the west, this is where you first see Scottish land, as anyone who's flown back from Canada or the United States will know. And the same is true if you turn the map upside down and travel south from Scandinavia or the north of Russia. Shetland first, then Orkney, and thereafter the mainland. And it's Professor Frank Rennie, who spoke to us at our last session from the UHI in Stornoway, who's made the point more effectively than anyone else I know, that we should use the term remote very carefully. Because when you live or work here in Cornwall or on a small island in the Hebrides, you're home, you're at the centre. It's Edinburgh and Glasgow or London that are remote, distant, and often not all that relevant. And this is important for what we what was also remarked by a number of speakers was how in former times, 1,000 years or so, I am a historian, 1,000 or more years ago, and up until the 14th century, it was the North and Western Islands that the Scandinavians wanted to control, and did, on their journeys south through the Minches, on the way to the Isle of Man, Ireland, and even the Mediterranean. And from the islands, they replenished their stores and food, and even seized people who they then sold as slaves in Dublin. In other words, far from being peripheral, Scotland's northern and western islands were on one of the most important sea routes in Europe. In Europe, far from being on the edge, a term which is sometimes used by present-day writers on the Hebrides, and I don't like it. They were on the Viking Age equivalent of the maritime M6. I don't think it must have been rather more pleasant than the M6 nowadays. Anyway, having been down there a couple of weeks ago, dear me. The traces of the importance of the islands in question to the Scandinavians, of course, are still with us, no more so than here in Orkney or Shetland, in place names, language, dialect, buildings, monuments, genetics, ethnic identity, and culture. And on this last subject, culture, we learned on Skye and in Stornoway about how integral to island culture in the past, were oral tradition and language, which continue as part of the fabric of island society, albeit they're now and have been for several centuries under immense pressure. But you also learnt from of some outstanding academic and especially community projects that are ensuring that the past isn't lost, and indeed that it's being actively deployed for the present and the future. And it's playing a vital role in sustaining the integrity and identity and sense of worth of the island communities. That comes over palpably in the Western Islands. For a mainland dweller like myself, one of the most remarkable and inspirational features of Lewis and Harris and parts of the US is the existence of and work being done by the historical societies. These aren't simply concerned with the past, they're providing the cultural foundations upon which people in their communities can act for the future. And part of the foundation is a palpable self-belief and a can-do attitude. Islanders, many of them anyway, have been and continue to be some of Scotland's most resilient peoples. So it's great then on our programme that we're going to be going through today and tomorrow that so many speakers are going to be talking about cultural aspects of Orkney life today and for the future. Now, a question that we might ask, and it's certainly asked in the Hebrides, is the extent to which government from Westminster or Holyrood has been, or is at present, good for the islands, and what are its limitations? The Scottish Government has an island strategy, but what does it achieve? Are the current constitutional arrangements working in the best interest of Scotland's island communities, and how might they be improved in the future? Well, we better not get into that because there's an election running and we shouldn't be commenting on such matters. Anyway, regardless of the answer to that question, what I think we can conclude from what we've done already in our previous sessions is this, that history isn't static. It marches on through time and never stops. And what's true nowadays is not always as it was, and how things are now need not determine the future. We're influenced by history, but we need not be its prisoners. Circumstances change and new opportunities arise, and we see so much of that in the islands we've talked about, been to and talked about in recent times. But this takes us to something which at first sight might seem to have been an immutable historic trend across Scotland's islands, and that is the problem of depopulation, something which Michael Anderson has written extensively about. The drain westwards of people across the Atlantic to America and Canada and south to the Scottish lowlands and beyonds of that vital resource, which, as I say, is people. Now, since 1861 and up to the census of 2001, the population of Scotland's islands fell from between 5 and 6% of the whole to 2%. Now, at first sight, this is a dismal tale of ever-decreasing numbers of island dwellers, although there was an upturn, as we heard in Skye when Michael was talking, that there was an upturn between 2001 and 2011. Indeed, Orkney's population, as I understand it, has continued to rise, reaching 22,500 in 2021. The taxi driver who took me from the airport to the hotel knew that figure, and he was very pleased with it, except when he was comparing it with the numbers of who gets off the cruise ships and apparently dominate the streets of Kirkwall, but give him lots of business. Decline, therefore, is neither inevitable nor inexorable. And our hope is that over the next 24 hours or so, we'll hear more about what the future holds for Orkney's population now and how life in the Northern Islands is to be sustained. Or that population is to be sustained and even grow. But the global numbers only take us so far. Much depends on island size. The number of inhabited islands fell by over 50% between 1861 and 2011. But some of the islands that experienced the sharpest falls and were more likely to become uninhabited were the smaller ones. And it's striking that of Orkney's around 70 islands, only 20 are inhabited. The vast majority of the population, as I understand it, 75% or thereabouts, live here on mainland Orkney, and over half of these in Kirkwall itself. So towns here and elsewhere, it seems, are preferable to living in isolation for most people. Now, there are exceptions, although they are few and far between and generally short-lived. It's the larger islands that have done better. Orkney, Shetland, Mull, Arran and Skye, for instance, have over the past 50 years seen increases in their populations, although none have recovered to their 19th century peaks. Will they ever do so? Well, this, I hope, is something that Michael Anderson might venture into tomorrow morning. One of the small islands I referred to, this is what took me into this islands project in the first instance, was one that my family lived on, and which I've written about and then talked about during the Skye session. And the island concerned was Pabby, which is a couple of miles off Broadford on Skye. Indeed, it was my family's experiences on Pabby, as I've just said, that alerted or sparked my interest in islands more generally, and caused me to appreciate the uniqueness and the challenges, the joys, but also the challenges of island life, certainly on smaller islands like that. So there we are. Sorry, I've just got some problem here turning a piece of paper. There we are. Now, my own family lived for 20 years or so, trying to make a living on that island, but in the end they had to give up. They were defeated, so I should say, so had many, many people before them. The island was at its peak in 1841 when there were 5 or 6 families there. Those numbers fell off after the potato famine and continued to fall off until by the middle of the 20th century there was no one on the island at all, and there was no one until my family went and lived there. Now, they were defeated by some of the factors that led to the abandonment of hundreds of small Scottish islands in the century beforehand. Surrounded by sea, and often rough seas, Scotland's islands are critically dependent, as everyone in here will know, upon sea transport, and I mean reliable sea transport. I explained that when we were in Skye last year on Pabby, my uncle lost over 14 boats in 20 years, owing to sea damage, if you like. And the reasons for this were various: the lack of a safe anchorage when the wind was blowing from the east, and the fact he was only able to afford second-hand boats that were often in poor shape and prone to leak or hard to manoeuvre at sea. There was a particularly rocky approach to that island, all of which meant periods when the family was cut off, or times when it was impossible to get livestock off the island at the optimum moments. Now, the challenges presented by the sea are more acute on small islands, or so I'd have said until recently. But we've seen in the more recent past that substandard vessels, inadequate infrastructure, and a lack of investment, sort of things my uncle faced on Pabby, can have an adverse effect on the transport links for larger islands too. Recent experience on the Western Isles routes over the Minch, but even on the Firth of Clyde, have highlighted the vulnerability of the islands in this regard. Now, happily, as I understand it, and I may be wrong here, I may be about to say something silly, but it seems to me, looking at this from somewhere in the south, that you have Northlink and Pentland ferries and Orkney ferries, which seem to have a better reputation as transport providers than Calmac. Certainly they're held up by some transport commentators, if you like, as being a superior way of running a ferry service. We could, however, devote a whole conference to the question of why the difference in performance and what lessons can be learned, and more important, what should be done to improve the situation. But we haven't got time to have that maybe it's one for the future days. But returning to Pabby and the problems of making a living on the smaller islands, other factors that drove my people to the mainland included the sheer brutality of the weather, wind in particular, which could flatten promising crops overnight or cut you off for weeks on end. There was too little money to drain wet, boggy land and dig ditches. There was the high, even unaffordable cost of employing additional labour at crucial moments, as well as as distance and accessibility of vital services such as healthcare. My uncle had 2 heart attacks on the island towards the end of his time there. That was the critical fact that drove him off, because my aunt wouldn't put up with it any longer because they couldn't get a doctor out for several days. Having the vet out was even more difficult, often. But not to be overlooked, though, it was the sheer social isolation and the fact that in small island communities, interpersonal relations can become corrosive. Now, I haven't done a lot of work on this, and so I'm not referring to Pabby when I say that, but I have done a little bit work on the island of Scalpay, which is a bigger island off Skye, and the population there at one time early in the 20th century was about 20 folks. And there is a bundle of papers in the Portree archives which are called something like Personal Problems, and they are letters from and to the owner and his factors, talking about just the animosity there was amongst ordinary people on the island. They just couldn't get on with each other. And so that's not maybe a factor on the smallest islands, but certainly on the smallish islands it can be an issue, I think. I'd like to write that up sometime. Anyway, but returning to PABI and the problems of making, sorry, I've interrupted myself. But so in contrast to this, what we've learned at our Islands Past and Island Present events is how important is the issue of critical mass. This is what the larger islands can provide. To survive and thrive, there have to be key and sometimes unique local industries or activities that create employment and sufficient numbers of people to provide and support essential services such as healthcare and education. And there's what's becoming an increasingly acute problem, certainly in the Western Islands. I'll be interested to hear about what's the situation in Orkney, a lack of affordable housing, not least for young people who are at the stage of wanting to create families, the island's future inhabitants who necessarily have to leave. Without these key social provisions, people leave, as has happened in South Uist, whereas with them, populations can grow, as on Skye, or in Stornoway, or here in Orkney, in Kirkwall. In this process, the state has a part to play through permissive legislation, grants and so on, but with local endeavour and enterprise often leading the way. That's, I think, one thing we've discovered or we've learned in the last couple of years, just the importance of the local and the community in leading the way in terms of island health, if you like. But another thing we learned in Stornoway and the Islands Present event was the importance of the community or communities. Drawing an understanding of their collective past and the potential of collective action, allied to remarkable powers of resilience, land buyout bodies like the North Harris Trust and the Golson Trust in Lewis have embraced the opportunities presented by the present to create viable, confident, forward-looking communities. These opportunities include the potential there is in tourism or wind farms to generate income that can be ploughed back into community halls, social housing and other benefits to the communities concerned. This, it seems to me, is sustainable development, about which we're going to hear more in the next 24 hours, but from an Orkney perspective. And this raises another theme which this series has thrown up, and that's the extent to which the past has influenced the present, adversely and otherwise. I mentioned the challenges presented for the islands by the wind. Indeed, from the 18th century, at least, the ferociousness of the wind has been seen by locals and outside observers as a destructive force, as it is. As an aside, but nonetheless relevant, when I was doing a bit of preparation for this event this weekend, I reread the published diaries of Patrick Fee of Stove on Sandy. It's an island to the north of here, as you will know. Fee's diaries cover the second half of the 18th century. He's a farmer and he kept an almost daily diary, which includes the weather. But they do, as I say, provide a day-by-day account of life in Orkney during that period. So it's striking that in the subject index, I don't know if anyone's ever checked this, that includes boats and dancing and cattle and fishing and so on. The word that's listed more than any other is, can you guess, gales. You know, so I think my point is sustained by the evidence. In fact, the best evidence often when you go to a new place is from the taxi driver. And the taxi driver who took me from the airport to the hotel earlier on, we somehow got talking about the wind, and he said when they get off that airport, or the planes in that airport during the winter months, they come off horizontally after having had a rough ride. And the first place they want him to take them to is the pub. So there we are. But the wind throws up benefits too, well maybe that's one of them. With fewer streams that could drive watermills on Orkney than places elsewhere, windmills were more of a feature than in other parts of Scotland. Essential for grinding grain, both for the resident population and for export. And of course here and elsewhere, the wind today is being harnessed and generating electricity and money for communities in those places where wind farms have been constructed. The best instances, though, of this, because there's a whole lot of controversy about it, as you will know, the best instances are where local communities, as here in Orkney, as I understand it, my reading of the evidence here, have themselves taken ownership of such developments to the extent that environmental concerns over the height of turbines, for example, have been taken into consideration. And what these examples demonstrate, as at Galson on Lewis, is that nature and progress don't need to be at odds with each other. The sea too can be seen, as I've said, as an immense challenge, which it is of course, but it's also being harnessed in order to create energy by wave and tidal power, as it had been for centuries in the form of tide mills, which were often used to grind grain. Indeed, in this field, Orkney is in the vanguard under the auspices of the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum. We're going to hear more about this later this afternoon, I think, when Erica Knott talks about offshore renewables. Am I right? Good. Seaweed, too, provides another example of something old and indigenous that in modern day parlance is being repurposed. And that's kelp, made from certain types of seaweed, which was a boon to landlords anyway in the late 18th century, early 19th centuries, in the Hebrides especially, but in Orkney too, less so in Shetland. But it's now re-established on the US and elsewhere on Scotland's west coast, including Skye, and is worth over £70 million a year, but happily without the wretched working conditions endured during the industry's first golden age, so-called golden age. It wasn't really, but for those many thousands of working people, it was a dreadful experience. And there's a very fine book written about it about this part of the world and kelp. Now it's a clean industry, using no fertilisers and with very little environmental impact. The processed kelp can be used for making plastic substitutes, beauty products and food supplements. And while no one, as far as I know, is burning or processing kelp on Orkney currently, Orkney is very much involved with the plant, with research being carried out on the carbon fixing potential of Orkney's underwater kelp forests. So, I'm going to wind up here now. I was going to say something about salt, but I won't. As I've hinted, developments like these in turn raise in turn questions relating to the environment, for wildlife and the landscape, issues that were less pressing in earlier times, or seem to have been less pressing in earlier times. But when you start digging around, you do find that the environment was an issue too in former times. So, for example, there's the case in the 18th century, which some of you will know about, of Patrick and John Fee, who in 1762 led a massive demonstration on Stronsay against the then expanding kelp industry. Such was the smoke from the many kilns that it was believed that corn crops had been ruined and cattle made sick. The stripping of the offshore seaweed was alleged had made fish scarce, while poor people went hungry as the limpets on seashore rocks fell off under the heat of the sun because they were no longer being covered by weed. And so aroused by the kelp plague was a sea monster. Hugh McDermott wouldn't like this, talking about monsters, but so aroused by the kelp plague was a sea monster that he spread a disease amongst the island's sheep. What was going on the shorelines, if you like, mattered. We may no longer believe in monsters, but there are individuals and bodies who are rightly concerned about the baneful effects on the natural environment of certain current and future island developments. So it'll be interesting to hear about what the future looks like for potentially damaging developments like multiple wind farms with 200-metre high turbines on land, as is being proposed at present on Skye, or out at sea, which is more relevant, I think, for people here, and aquaculture or salmon farming. They're all raising issues about compatibility with nature. In financial terms, the Scottish salmon fishing is massive. It's flourishing, with sales worth over £645 million last year and employing over 2,500 people directly and many more indirectly. But is there a trade-off as regards pollution and the harm done to wild fish? Well, Tavish Scott will be talking about this tomorrow when he looks at the future of salmon farming. So, I think I've said enough. I hope what I've said explains why we're here and raises some of the issues I hope we're going to get involved with. But now we're going to delve into the future, led by my colleague Des. So take us into the future, Des. Thank you very much.
Chris, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. We've got plenty of time. Because we've got people joining online, we need to keep to our schedule, so we've got plenty of time for questions. Any questions for Chris? I've got a couple, but salt. Because I asked you about salt,
Yes,
and Lewis, and it's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Sorry. So salt, Chris.
So,
would you
yeah,
care to-
indeed, I can answer that one. I can give you the same answer. Sorry,
Yeah.
I can give you the same answer virtually as I gave you on Sky. And it so happens that the last book I put out was Salt, Scotland's newest, oldest industry. And the reason why it has that title is salt was a huge industry in Scotland, or certainly an important industry from the 11th century onwards. Now, and it fell into, it disappeared more or less in the 1850s, and the last sea salt manufacturing plant in Scotland closed in 1950 or 1959, and that's down at Preston Pans. And then nothing happened. But then, about 10 years ago, a couple of people on Skye set up the Isle of Skye Salt Company, and they are now manufacturing salt, which is going around the world. The same is happening in Shetland. I think there's another plant in Islay. There's certainly one in St. Mornan. So salt, that ancient Scottish industry, is coming back with all of its good, all past marks in terms of environment. Because that salt that I'm talking about, the old salt, if you like, the marine salt, was produced by burning loads of coal and peat in Eddie, if that's how you pronounce it, not here. But these salt works nowadays use the heat of the sun, believe it or not, in Scotland, under holly tunnels. So there's a repurposed industry.
Thank you, Chris. Any more questions? Come on, don't be shy. Because I've got quite a provocative question that came to mind when we were in the bookshop earlier on today. Brilliant Orkney bookshop. And I was struck by the number of books on the Second World War in Orkney, and it got me thinking to ask you the question: does the literature that we have in Orkney fairly reflect history as you see it? Because it strikes me that there are some real biases in the literature. I was staggered at the amount of books on the Second World War, and yet, from my own interest in natural history, very small number, relatively small number of books. But some fantastic, very recent books. So, is that a fair question? Does history not always reflect, or literature not always reflect the importance of different historical events?
Well, of course, the Second World War was hugely important in here and indeed in Shetland, and there have been some wonderful books, which real detailed studies of the impact of aspects of war on these islands, and indeed, you'll know the case of the ILA, the disaster in Stornoway at the end of the First World War, and that, there's a lot of books in Stornoway about that, or researched and then written about. But the thing that strikes me about much of Orkney's history that I've read about, a lot of it, so much of it is archaeological, and rightly so, because there's a lot of archaeological remains around here. So in a sense, local historians are benefiting from taking the opportunity there are of writing about things which matter in their local community. There are some good books on Orkney's history, but there are fewer books on Orkney's history than there say on in many other parts of Scotland. And we do. There's Peter Marshall's latest one, which is very, very good. But there's an opportunity. There's always opportunity for more history.
So I guess I'm trying to. So the challenge there is: do you feel there are particular aspects or periods in time that are underrepresented in the literature? And thinking of students here, people interested in new lines of work.
Well, I'm flicking through my card catalogue of recent readings here, and not coming up with much. Certainly, I would say a problem or a weakness, a lacuna, if you like, in Scottish history until very, very recently was the early modern period, where we knew a lot about politics and unions and so forth, but less about, if you like, everyday life. And that's true of Scotland too. I mean, when I did was a general editor for a series of books on everyday life in Scotland, and the single book I was responsible for was Everyday Life 1600 to 1800, and there was and one of the critics afterwards said there's too much here. There's a lot in the 18th century, but not much in the 17th century, and I think that applies across Scotland, and Austin would be part of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. Any more questions?
Next business, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. We've got a number of breaks in the programme, so we'll have an opportunity to chat one-to-one with Chris and the other speakers. But thank you very much. I think that deserves another round of applause.
Thank you.
That's brilliant. So without any further ado, we're going to move on to Antonia. And Antonia, are you ready to go? We've got your presentation up there. It's ready
Hi, everyone.
to go. It's been buzzing to go.
I'll just get myself set up. I think so.
So, Antonia, we've got, as I say, the detailed biographical notes, but you're a local Antonia, well known to people.
Well, I've only been here 18 years. I'm not sure it qualifies just yet.
In that case, you're a newcomer, I suspect. And I see you've got great interest in the Nessa Brodgar.
Yes, which starts next week.
So
yes.
we look forward to hearing more about you. So, Antonia, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And can everyone hear me okay at the back and online as well? Thank you very much. Okay, get my specs on. Okay, so over the past 15 years, the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute, based here in Orkney, has established an interdisciplinary research and teaching model with art and archaeology a key focus. And in today's talk, I want to introduce our creative approach to archaeology that we have here in Orkney and how research, teaching, art practice and knowledge exchange come together in a uniquely island-based but future-oriented way of thinking. Okay. Central to these developments is the Contemporary Art and Archaeology MA, a unique online course that brings together art practice with the archaeological study of visual and material culture. As an academic, my teaching and research explore the relationship between art and archaeology, using these as reference points from which to explore wider creative engagements across and beyond a range of different disciplines. Together with my colleague Anne Bevan, a visual artist and sculptor who was until recently the head of art and design at UHI Orkney, I launched this course in September 2020. Yes, 2020, that year that most of us would rather forget. I'll come back to the MA a little bit later, but first I want to set the scene for this bringing together of what appears at first sight to be two rather different disciplines, contemporary art and archaeology. One is ostensibly associated with the contemporary and the present, even the future, whilst the other is associated, at least in the popular imagination, with the past. And if it seems a little curious to bring contemporary art and archaeology together as disciplines, then doing this from Orkney and as an online delivered course might seem even stranger. But Orkney's location is key in this relationship, as is its relationship with the UHI. The UHI's hybrid and online delivery models means that students are able to join us not only from the Highlands and Islands, but from every inhabited continent in the world. And since we launched the MA in 2020, nearly 50 students from the USA, Canada, the Republic of Ireland, Greece, Germany, and of course from across the UK, have come through or are currently studying on the MA. Despite the course being delivered for the most part online, Orkney's power of place is fundamental. There you go, nice stone circle for you there, Chris. There is, of course, a very long history of artists being interested in Orkney's archaeology. The archipelago's position means that the islands have always played host to travellers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Orkney started to capture the imagination of those with the means to travel to what was for them the far reaches of the British Isles.
And some of the earliest views we have of our archaeological sites are artistic depictions from this Romantic age. Views such as this etching by William Daniel of the Ring of Brogga from his epic A Voyage Round Great Britain, which is often described as the most important book in the history of British topography. A century and a half later, in 1976, the Edinburgh Arts Summer School, led by curator Richard DeMarco, visited the islands, an extraordinary group of artists, poets, archaeologists and more. They were on a 70-day, 7,500-mile journey from Malta to Orkney, from Hagakim to the Ring of Brogga, on a summer school whose syllabus deliberately combined the avant-garde with the traditional and historical, drawing parallels and connections with the cutting edge of contemporary art and what had gone before, often by millennia. The Edinburgh Arts Group were interested in exploring prehistoric and Celtic art as parallels to contemporary visual culture, drawing inspiration directly from the ancient sites and stone monuments they visited. These visits, 50 years later, still provide a key historical context for thinking about art and archaeology in Orkney. As George Mackay-Brown famously said, and you'll see quoted just about everywhere in Orkney, the Orkney imagination is haunted by time. The island's archaeology and history dominate so much here in the present. It would be wrong, however, though, to think that this relationship between art and archaeology in Orkney, or anywhere else for that matter, is just focused on the past. Orkney is a place as much aware of its contemporary identity and its future direction as it is of its ancient history. Orkney is a world leader in renewable energy innovation, and the island's hills and seas are now home to large wind turbines and marine renewable devices. Contemporary archaeological monuments that evidence a new relationship with the environment. This indeed is a contemporary archaeology, or even the future archaeology described by poet and ethnographer Laura Watts in her 2018 book, Energy at the End of the World, an Orkney Islands Saga. Another key context for thinking about art and archaeology in Orkney, the incredible Ness of Brogga. And you can't mention archaeology or think about archaeology in Orkney without thinking about the Ness. And excavations start there again on Monday. And if you haven't been, I absolutely urge you to go because it's incredible. It's one of the most incredible sites being excavated anywhere in the world. And this is the last season. It comprises extraordinary monumental 5,000-year-old structures with walls standing up to 1 metre high in places, many of which have the original carvings and decoration surviving on them. For the past 16 years or so, I have been lucky enough to study the incredible decorated stonework from the Ness of Brogga. Nearly 1,000 individual stones with deliberate markings have been recorded from the site, making this the largest collection of its kind from anywhere in Northern Europe. The decoration is nearly always abstract and is almost entirely geometric and linear, with marks ranging from simple scratches, which can look like tallies or mason's marks, to heavily incised elaborate patterns formed by saltires, lozenges, chevrons and zigzags. There are some beautiful examples, and it certainly seems appropriate to call these art. Just look at this artefact, a heart-shaped, water-rolled stone, just like the ones we all like to pick up on the beach. But this one is carved with faint, crossing lines forming a lozenge lattice pattern, which mirror the marks in Orkney's bedrock. An intersection of art, archaeology and geology over a vast timescale. My research interests lie in these mark-making and inscription practices, and how drawing, whether with a pencil or a flint, works to connect time and space. At a different scale, perhaps, Anne Bevan's work also connects time and space, art, archaeology and geology. When she was artist in residence for Orkney Beside the Ocean of Time, a multidisciplinary research project, and its name, of course, another nod to George Mackay-Brown, she examined layers of time and change in Orkney, from the slow geological shift of deep time to our more rapid human intervention. As well as walking, drawing, and making, it involved her in dialogue with geology, marine biology, energy, and archaeology, as well as engaging with the many stories, histories, and memories evoked by the West Shore. These sort of interdisciplinary creative projects have laid the foundation for the research-led teaching in contemporary art and archaeology here at UHI. Running through all of these projects is an interest in process-led practice. In some ways, a contemporary response to the process-led drawing, walking and mapping of Richard Long, shown here on the left, and his walking practice, artist and archaeologist Dan Lee explores his particular form of art archaeology through mapping. The image on the right here is a GPS map produced from walking the coast of the island of Papi, a creative process that inspired a further aspect to art archaeology at UHI, that of knowledge exchange. In the last ref, the researcher exercise in 2021, this helped form one of our case studies, impact case studies in art archaeology. Inspired by his experimental mapping, Dan Lee and fashion designer Kirstine Stewart developed an innovative creative process linking digital archaeological drawings with contemporary product design. They collaborated on unique, place-specific drawings, translated into digital maps and inspiring the Wander collection of 12 items of clothing and accessories, each a form of mobile map embodying specific landscapes. Other knowledge exchange projects have emerged from my research into Neolithic art, such as the Brodgar collection created by Ola Gori Jewellery. Line, process, trace, translated into a stunning collection of contemporary jewellery. Ancient art, reinterpreted as 21st century design. And so in thinking about the relationship between art and archaeology here, some key themes emerge. That of practice-based research, leading into research-led teaching, the importance of interdisciplinarity, and the way it can impact knowledge exchange. This image here is part of Helen Garbutt's Creative Practice PhD, which she's undertaking at the Centre for Island Creativity at Shetland UHI, and I'm one of her supervisors. This is a unique project which is combining socially engaged art, ecology, and archaeology in an exploration of the entanglements of humans and limpets. And there she is. She calls herself the limpet woman. She's got this incredible limpet costume. But at this point, I would like to return to thinking about the teaching, and in particular, the MA Contemporary Art and Archaeology. Teaching, of course, is not only a form of knowledge exchange in its own right, but also a form of collaborative, socially engaged practice. The MA is team-taught and draws on diverse influences, but much of the thinking which inspires our methodology can be seen to originate in the critical ideas around art and pedagogy that emerged in Europe and the USA during the 20th century. Although distinctive, these involve interdisciplinary collaboration, learning through doing, and the blurring of boundaries between not only disciplines, but between teacher and student, research and practice. And here we can see another link, perhaps, with Edinburgh Arts and the history of art and archaeology in Orkney. In 1968, Scottish artist curator Richard DeMarco met Joseph Beuys in Germany and persuaded him to make his UK debut at Edinburgh Festival. Inspired by Beuys' Free International University for Creativity and Interdisciplinary Research, between 1972 and 1980, DeMarco set up Edinburgh Art Summer Schools. As we saw earlier, these included trips to Orkney's archaeological sites. They approached learning and teaching through art as an interdisciplinary pursuit that included ecology, architecture, archaeology and literature, as well as traditional crafts and folk culture. I like to think that there is something of the spirit of these earlier interdisciplinary and collaborative endeavours that lives on in our teaching on the MA. And with that in mind, and to demonstrate the variety of work that's being produced, I would just like to quickly showcase some of the students who graduated last year in 2023. Susie Mackenzie. Susie's final project involved a search for wonder in the threshold between writing and mark making. Influenced by archaeological theories regarding the construction of Neolithic burial monuments, her project comprised a range of practice-led approaches and included suminagashi marbling, printmaking, paper construction techniques, and writing as drawing. These explored different approaches to wonder through poetry, artist books, prints, photographs, letters, and maps. And the final stage of her project saw pieces taken out of the studio and taken to the Neolithic stone setting at Akavanik in Caithness to close the circle of their archaeology to art to archaeology journey. Staying in the Highlands, Susan Torrance's project, Voices from the Archives, used the archives of the Inverness Courier newspaper as a starting point for a rich dive into a fascinating time in 20th century Scottish history. The development of the North of Scotland Hydroelectricity Board and hydroelectric power in the Highlands. Dr. Evan Barron and his niece Evelyn Barron, who ran the Inverness Courier for 70 years into 1988, were supportive of these schemes, and their editorials contained impassioned arguments in support of hydroelectric power. Susan selected excerpts of these editorials and crafted them into a script so that modern actors could resurrect them as voices from the archive. This script was then performed as a site-specific work within the tunnel at Cruachan, 1,200 feet below the dam and reservoir in the mountain. In her project, Antala, Giving a Voice to the Voiceless, MA student Aileen Ogilvie used her background in music production and performance and her expertise as a Gaelic speaker and singer-songwriter to study the empty Perth City Hall, which at that point had lain empty since 2005, although of course it has just recently reopened. She used her tool as an innovative tool of her voice as an innovative tool of archaeological inquiry by performing Gaelic songs in different areas of the abandoned hall to investigate the interaction between tangible and intangible heritage. She then built on this methodology in her final work, Croft No. 4, which comprised a creative practice-led project focused on the residues of the past which linger into their present in her croft near Golspie. Sound recordings allowed her to excavate traces of the past and create a 25-minute-long sonic artefact which collaged fragments of recorded voices, found and reimagined sounds, song, music, weaving these all together with historical narratives. Lucy Carr McClave created a 21-minute-long experimental film entitled A Small Document of Archaeology. This explored the use of experimental art film as a format for representing alternative perspectives of archaeological practice. She edited fragments from video interviews with archaeologists and artists about their work, focusing on their hands, to emphasise the significance of the intimate and reflective discussions surrounding archaeology, so often disregarded in conventional documentary media. And I'm delighted to say that Lucy will be joining us at the Nessa Brogga this summer to kind of, in a new chapter in her filmmaking ventures. And finally, Aaron McCarthy, who actually worked with Donna last year on a Fragile Correspondence at the Architecture Biennale in Venice. Aaron also worked in film for his final project, developing a moving image work, stills of which are shown here, which responded to Neolithic sites in Orkney. But the final work was an experimental film which drew on influences from science fiction as well as contemporary art and archaeology to create a disorientating piece which saw the Neolithic in dialogue with the Anthropocene. This conversation between past, present and future is perhaps what typifies Orkney and its relationship to land and people, and perhaps also the wider UHI region. Because from crofting landscapes and ancient monuments to renewable energy and cutting-edge technology, the Highlands and Islands, and Orkney in particular perhaps, are really where past, present and future meet at the interface of the global and local. And here at the UHI, through the MA Contemporary Art and Archaeology, we're able to explore both the deep past of this fascinating region and play a role in its sustainable creative future. Thank you.
Any questions? That's all right. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? It's absolutely fabulously illustrated talk. I must say I was struck by the landscape similarities between Callanish and what you've been describing here, which I hadn't really thought about before in terms of the backdrop. It was absolutely extraordinary. You use the word wonder, and in the sciences we often use the word curiosity. How important is curiosity as opposed to wonder in the endeavours you've been describing?
Well, wonder was one of the UHI's research themes, which was how Susie ended up linking in with it as an idea. But I think in terms of curiosity, wonder, all of these sorts of things, that for me is why I get quite excited about that place where art and archaeology meet, perhaps. And I always think science is actually very creative. And I think it's kind of often, it's not true to put them at opposite ends of the scale. I think science is extremely imaginative, creative, and it's full of wonder and curiosity. And I think having archaeology in many ways can bridge those worlds, but when you bring in art practice as well, I think it just opens everything up to be very exciting.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's interesting the dissertation you mentioned on the hand, because some of us were with Alice Roberts last night, and she was talking in great detail about the hand and the importance of the hand, but not talking about the importance of hand in archaeology, but just other facets. So that sounds like a terrific dissertation.
Yes, yeah, it's a good film.
Any comments or questions before we break for coffee? We've got time. Yes. Oh, two hands. Donna first, if that's all right.
Thank you. I was just wanting to ask how far you think the interpretation of the images requires context, or whether you can just look at the image, quiet an image, without considering the context.
Any particular images, or?
Well, the Nessa Brodgar, for example.
Oh, the carvings there.
Yes.
Well, I'm very much of the opinion that we can't interpret them as a text, and I'm very interested in the kind of more performative and the process-led kind of ways of understanding art is where I come from with it. And I think when you start to think about, I think if we move away from the visual is very much this kind of post-enlightenment obsession we have with particular senses that dominate over other things. We live in a world of books and text, and I think we tend to put that onto the past and assume that the world was always like that. But there's extremely sophisticated societies which are non-literate in our, if you compare them to kind of Western modern cultures, yet they're extremely sophisticated. I think with a lot of the abstract patterns at the Nessa Brodgar, perhaps they maybe didn't always mean something, but I think we also need to be aware of putting blanket interpretations over what is a vast kind of panoply of different forms of mark making and inscription, some of which may be graffiti or doodles, some of which may be mason's marks, some of which may absolutely be intended to communicate a message. And I think within that there's such a broad range of things that I kind of try and steer away from being too essentialist and generalising about them.
Thank you, Antonia. Yes.
I think it's a wonderful example of interdisciplinarity and kind of engagement between disciplines. And what I was wondering about is how far you think this sort of interdisciplinarity is facilitated by the place. So I was struck by, perhaps what we have here in terms of the archaeology, but also in terms of, being a relatively small community of scholars and those kinds of things as well. So I just wondered how far you think this interdisciplinary kind of collaboration might have come about elsewhere, and how far the place is important in that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think Orkney is very much it's almost the stage is set in Orkney for this, and I think it is partly to do with the community. I think anyone who stays in Orkney, you have friends who work in a whole range of different industries and disciplines, often many at once or at different times, and you end up having these sort of conversations that enables you to find out about worlds that perhaps if you lived in a city or you lived in somewhere else, you'd stay in your own bubble and you wouldn't maybe interact with. And you could say the same thing about kind of just wider society full stop, and you think about the kind of multi-generational kind of conversations that happen in island communities, I think are very distinctive as well. And I think kind of, you know, but yeah, I think it's a very Orkney thing.
Thank you.
An Orkney thing, absolutely. Any other comments or questions? Where do your students come from?
Mainly from Scotland and the rest of the UK, but also we have quite a few international students. So we have quite a few American students and Canadian students, and that's something that is I think it's perhaps a pattern that's replicated across the UHI, that the kind of Scottish diaspora is very much a part of our kind of student cohort, and I think that's part of, you know, kind of, but again, it's not just Orkney. The power of place, I think, across the Highlands and Islands is very, very strong with the UHI.
Yeah, absolutely, and reaching into
Yeah.
that diaspora and getting returns. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can we join me again in thanking Antonia? Now, we're going to have a break now, tea coffee break, and if we could be back for 2:35, that would be excellent. And I think tea coffee's just through there. It's on its way. Brilliant. Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks very much. We all right?
Kill sound for the moment. Kill sound. I'm going to make it.
So welcome back. We're all refreshed now. Apologies for the sort of Taylor Swift concert setup here, but I hope you can now hear us at the back, if that's all right. Is that okay? I'm just looking at the back. No, and Mrs. Thompson is sort of, what are you beckoning? You saying go home, or what? You still can't hear us. Is that better there? So we just talk quite close to the audience. Okay, thanks very much. So without any further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to have Jo Porter here, seabird ecologist, benthics specialist, carbon expert in the marine environment, strongly working for over many years with Heriot Watt University based in Orkney. And Jo, we're really looking forward to hearing about the future of the marine environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jo. Yes, a round of applause for Jo.
Thank you. Let's make sure I've got this in the right place to start. Okay, does that sound good? Yeah. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. As you know, marine environment is very close to me, and I've devoted my life working in the marine environment. I came to Orkney to work at the International Centre for Island Technology, Heriot Watt University, full-time in 2016. And prior to that, I'd done research projects before then, and I decided I wanted to make that jump to Orkney because of the quality of the marine environment here. So I was really, really excited to get this invitation to speak today, because I think we are entering a critical time in the marine environment, and there's some particular things that I'd like to raise awareness about that are happening in the Orkney Islands. But I want to just be clear what I'm going to be talking about today, because there's so much we could talk about. So as regards the marine part, I'll be focusing in on the inshore coastal waters. So I won't be talking about the sea, the offshore area. And when we talk about environment, I'll be talking about the physical seabed and the biological ecosystems inhabiting that physical seabed. And I particularly want to focus today on the ecosystem services that those seabed environments provide to us as members of society. And I'm doing a little bit of indulging, because I'm going to talk about some case examples from work that I've done overseas in other island communities, and then I'm coming back to Orkney to talk about what's happening specifically here, and how some of the things I've seen overseas inspire and influence me to do work here in what I now call my own backyard. And hopefully that's going to have a future-looking aspect to it as well, to fit the scope of today's session. So I'd like to just start by talking about island communities and how they can benefit from these services that are provided by the coastal marine ecosystems. I'm sorry if there's people in the audience who already heard about these things, but just in case there's people that haven't, I wanted to really reiterate these services. So for example, we've got 4 different types of services that the environment's providing to us. We've got the provisioning services, the cultural services, which we've heard about already in the previous talks. We've got the supporting services, and we've got the regulating services. And just to give an example or so from each one, for example, in the provisioning services, we've got things like sand and gravel. Sounds really boring, but very important. We've got energy, and we've also got harvesting of resources, fish and shellfish stocks, that kind of thing. In the cultural services, we've got tourism and recreation. We've got our seascapes, our wildlife watching. We've got our creativity and art. And we've got things like health and well-being as well. We like to go out into that environment, and it makes us feel good. In our regulating services, Our coastlines help to provide storm protection, very important in a time when we're now experiencing a lot more frequent storm events and a lot more severe storm events. We've got carbon storage, and we've got things like sediment stabilisation and coastal erosion aspects. And in our supporting services, we've got things like the cycling of nutrients, the cycling of water, we've got the supply of larvae and gametes, and we've also got habitats for species. So that's where our biodiversity services come in. And these are all benefits that we enjoy. They're happening all day, every day, but are we always aware of them? You know, and this is a thing that I want to bring to the fore of people's minds. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to just go through a few examples of different island areas that I've had the absolute joy to visit during my career as a marine scientist. So I'm going to take you on a journey to Svalbard in the Arctic. I'm going to take you to Galapagos. I'm going to take you to Bedong Island in Malaysia. And I'm recently just back from a trip to Selayar in the Indonesian archipelago. And I've been learning a lot of different things along the way, and I'm going to bring that back to the Orkney Isles and talk about the impact there that I think we can have in the future. So let's go first of all to Svalbard. You may be aware that this is one of the fastest warming places on the planet. And because of the conditions changing there, a lot of the glacial areas are now receding. And the problem of that is that we're getting a lot of meltwater coming down from the glaciers and entering into the coastal areas. So I've been fortunate to go twice to Svalbard with colleagues from Poland, actually. And the position of the glacier over that 10-year period of my two visits was really, really different and quite shocking. In the marine environment, we were actually doing scientific diving surveys, and we were looking at animals that live in association with marine algae or seaweed. And we were finding that we're having to change our study locations, because with the additional meltwater now, that's causing an increased turbidity or cloudiness in the water. And of course then the seaweed isn't getting as much light, and therefore the seaweed's dying back and changing its distribution. So even just in that short space of 10 years, we've had to really rethink our monitoring and our research there to compensate for these changes. And obviously if we're having a lack of seaweeds there now, this is having a consequence for the food web. So all those animals and other plants that would have grown on the seaweed, now they are getting reduced as well. So there's an impact on the biodiversity there. So there's quite a lot of consequences then on up into the higher kind of food chain, if you like, both for carbon sequestration and also for trophic structure. So that's one kind of type of impression that I'm bringing back from Svalbard, but I'm taking you now onto Galapagos. So in Galapagos, one of the reasons we were visiting there is because of a project about the marine park area. So the Galapagos economy is very much focused on wildlife tourism, very high quality wildlife tourism, because they've got a large and healthy populations of endemic fauna and flora. And I'm sure you've all seen the David Attenborough, the marine iguana, the Galapagos shark, the blue-footed booby, a classic one, and there's a lot of other fauna there that's really interesting and very different, obviously, to what we're used to. And so for me, it's a trip of a lifetime to go somewhere like that, and to be doing research with the Charles Darwin Foundation because of an encroachment of the islands by the Chinese industrial fishing fleet. So people in the islands wanting to know and understand what could be done about the issue of the encroachment. And there was a strong feeling in the community that they'd like to be able to kind of formally extend the marine park area. But how could they actually do that? How could they fund that? Because obviously policing these areas takes quite a lot of money and people to do it. But the interesting thing about Galapagos is because they take it so seriously, there's a lot of employment in the island of marine park rangers. And the marine park rangers, the salaries for the rangers come because everybody that visits Galapagos has to pay a marine park entrance fee. So in a way, they're making a sensible decision to charge people to come into the islands to benefit from being in with the fauna and flora, but they're doing that in a very controlled way, and it's providing employment for people in the island. And I went on several of the trips just to try and understand from a scientific point how that works. And I have to say it's a really interesting experience because, okay, it's quite expensive to pay the fee, but on the other hand, the level of attention to detail that the customers get is absolutely top-notch. And I'm sure I would have learnt a lot more by having that experience than if I just went on my own, or if there wasn't a ranger, a knowledgeable ranger there. So we actually did a study together with the Charles Darwin Foundation on something that's called willingness to pay. And this is a thing that's not my usual bag. I'm not a social scientist, but I worked with a social scientist because we wanted to particularly target snorkeling and scuba diving tourists to take part in this survey. And we generated a number of questions about how much more would they be willing to pay. We gave them options of different prices, and we asked them if they could contribute yes or no, and if yes, how much more would they be willing to contribute. And from that we could work out whether it would in fact be possible to go ahead with an extension to the marine park. And with that information from the survey, the Charles Darwin Foundation and the local people have been able to go back then to policymakers and make suggestions of trying to take that forward. So we wait with anticipation, but hopefully that's a development in progress. And I thought it was quite refreshing that was coming from the ground up in response to a very specific challenge, but I think it's a challenge that's being felt in other areas too. And of course, you can't go to Galapagos without a visit to the Lonesome George Museum. And for me, this is a very stark reminder of this now icon of biodiversity loss, which was caused by overexploitation by passing traders. So we need to keep these things in mind. This is what's happened. Do we want to repeat these things in the future? And how can we work together to stop the biodiversity loss? How can we use it to our advantage in a sustainable way? So moving on then to Malaysia, and I wanted to mention this because for the last 7 or 8 years now, we've been in a partnership for learning and teaching with the University Malaysia Terengganu. And the university there actually have a kind of arrangement with the Malaysian government that they look after the island. And in the island there, it's been designated as a protected area. and they've also turned part of the area into a marine research station. And so we've been fortunate to be able to team up with UMT to take a group of master's students every summer for coral reef monitoring and management training. And Emily's in the room today. She just came back a few weeks ago, so please feel free to chat to Emily about that. Before it became an MPA with UMT, it was used historically as a refuge island by thousands of Vietnamese refugees, and they were based there until the late 1980s. And there's cultural heritage also in the island there, remnant from the people being there. And people actually going back on pilgrimages now, you know, and taking their families to see an important part of their history. But from my point of view, it's a highly biodiverse fringing coral reef island. And unfortunately for us, in 2019, there was a very large and intensive storm called Pabuk, which caused a huge amount of damage to the reef. And so after we were able to get back to the island, we've now spent the last few years working with the UMT scientists to trial different types of restoration to rebuild the coral reef. And the picture at the bottom there, you can see a group of our students there with their transplants ready to go and put them out on the reef there. And it's a kind of bittersweet story in a way, because we've done a lot of work to restore the reef, and it was doing quite well when we were there 5 weeks ago. And then yesterday I got a message from my colleague, Dr. Yusri, to say that they've now been impacted by the coral bleaching and the whole reef is gone. So these things are happening, and it's very, very distressing when these things happen. But we have to try and stay hopeful. So we're talking with colleagues now to see what the next steps will be and how we can support with that going forwards. So moving on to Selayar, this is an island in South Sulawesi, Indonesia, and Selayar Island is home to the Baju indigenous communities. These are people that were having a previously nomadic life, living in boats, moving from place to place, and having a relatively low impact on the environment by moving around and making best use of resources. Unfortunately now they're confined to coastal areas, but they still try to keep their traditions and their way of life. And they're very, very dependent on coral reefs, mangrove and seagrass habitats for their livelihoods. The particular area I was visiting was bordering the Takabonerate Biosphere Reserve. And in this area, even though it is a reserve, unfortunately, local livelihoods are being impacted by severe habitat degradation. So some of the things that are happening are bombing of the coral reefs, poisoning of the corals to actually anaesthetise fish, to collect fish for the aquarium trade. There's been a lot of shrimp farming, where they've dug out mangrove areas, they've done intensive shrimp farming, and then when the ponds become polluted, they actually abandon them and dig another pond. So there's whole coastline areas of abandoned toxic shrimp ponds. And one of the things that's really quite shocking as well is the high levels of plastic pollution that are coming actually from elsewhere. And how do local people deal with that when the waste management systems just aren't in place to deal with it? So, and we were talking with women in the village there, asking them about how they want to try to move forward. And we were asking about the reasons why people would be, bombing the coral reef, given that that's the thing that sustains them. And they were saying that because they live in a cash-poor economy, if they need money for something, a quick way to go and get it is to bomb a reef, get some fish, sell them, get the money, then they can send their child to school. So you can see why they would do it for the short-term monetary gain, but in the long term, obviously, you end up with these really horrific issues that are much more difficult to resolve. So this is an ongoing piece of work, and we'll be doing more on this in the future. But let's just recap. Hopefully you can see from some of the examples that island communities are dependent on healthy and productive marine ecosystem services. And that's including the regulating, the supporting, the provisioning, and the cultural services. So the question is, how can these resources and services be future-proofed? And obviously we've got these key threats which we need to consider when we're coming up with the solutions. We've got climate change impact, physical damage, pollution, over-exploitation of resources, and I didn't mention it in any of those other examples, but there are also invasive species which could cause problems. So I'm bringing all that back to Orkney now, and as we're all aware, Orkney Islanders have long depended on and made a very creative use of the resources provided both by the land and by the marine environment. In Orkney, we are geographically near to the mainland of Scotland, but we do have this very strong separation of this very fearsome stretch of water, the Pentland Firth. And we are at the meeting point of the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea, which provides extremely distinctive hydrodynamic conditions, and also leads to a diverse range of marine habitats. And so we've got the full range, I would say, from highly sheltered to extremely exposed environments in Orkney. So we've got a combination of features to bear in mind. Because we've got this meeting of the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea, we experience very strong tidal flows. We don't have any major river systems, but we do have a farming industry, and we do get runoff from the land. We are increasingly getting high levels of finfish aquaculture, and we also have wild fish capture fisheries. From the energy side, we've got Flotta Oil Terminal, we've also got ship-to-ship transfers in Scapa Flow, and we're having a burgeoning marine renewable energy industry. And on the tourism side, we've got a huge amount of historical shipwrecks, with lots of divers coming every year to visit these sites. We've got a tourism industry, including now a burgeoning cruise ship industry, and we've also got a lot of conservation designations, which in turn attracts a wildlife tourism. So we've got all this going on in a relatively compact area. And when we fly into Orkney, we can look out of the aeroplane window and we can see the green fields, we can see the agriculture, and we can also see the beautiful coastline, and the clarity of the water is absolutely tremendous here for reasons that we've just been discussing. But can we actually see what's going on the seabed? And are we fully aware of what's going on there? So our marine ecosystem services in Orkney are underpinned by healthy, biodiverse and productive habitats. And we are very blessed to have quite a diverse range. including merle, which is a calcified seaweed. That's the pink twiggy things you can see in the top right there. We've got a lot of seagrass, very healthy seagrass meadow. There's been a lot of work going on. I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of the different projects going on with seagrass. We've got huge amounts of kelp forest, and I was very pleased in the earlier presentation to hear about the history of that. We've also got salt marshes, shellfish beds, we've got animal turf thickets, we've got huge amounts of marine sediment, and we've got a very rich and diverse intertidal algal forest. So we've got a lot there that we can use in a sensible way. So this leads me to a few questions. I'm not necessarily going to answer these questions, but I'm going to pose them. So where are these resources and services? Are people really aware of them? I know some people are, but I think there's an awful lot of people that maybe aren't. Who's actually responsible for them? What kind of condition are they in? And how can they be maintained? How do we know that they're not deteriorating? And if they do deteriorate, what are the consequences for that? We hear a lot of talk about restoration projects. Actually, do we have all the knowledge we need to do restoration if we do trash these habitats? How long does restoration take? I've got a colleague working in the Dornoch Firth, and it's already been 10 years restoring an oyster reef there. So we're not talking about a 1 year, 2 year, 6 month. We're talking serious lengths of time. How much does it cost? And who's going to pay for it? And who cares? So I'm posing these questions, yes, against the backdrop that we've actually got very nice habitats in Orkney that are providing excellent services to our community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Orkney Islands in a bit more detail. The size of the region makes it tractable to collate reasonable knowledge of marine habitats and the ecosystem services. We know there are some areas of good condition, but we also know there's still gaps in the knowledge. We don't actually have comprehensive maps of these things, but we do have the tools and wherewithal to make these maps. We also know that there are areas of poor condition. Now, a question would be, can we reduce these areas of poor condition? And in some cases, would we restore them? How is effective maintenance best achieved for the benefit of island communities? And which services are most important? And who is involved in the collection of the information? So let's just talk about some brief examples. This is the merle, the seaweed.
We're running out of time.
Yes, I'm going to keep it very quick to get to the finish point. In the merle, we've got the largest area of merle bed in Scotland, nationally important resource of merle. It's a biodiversity hotspot and it sequesters carbon. With merle, a healthy seabed at the bottom right there, a seabed that's been dredged with trawling. And I'm just going to make the point that even in our marine protected areas, at the moment, we cannot stop trawling. So this is something that has to change. We've been addressing some data gaps on this in Orkney, and I want to just highlight very briefly my recent PhD student, Jack. And we've worked with Sula Diving, local company, to actually understand more about the extent of the merle in Orkney and the underlying thickness of the sedimentary deposits. And we published this paper in Nature Scientific Reports earlier this year. So we are actually doing world-class research on world-class habitats in Orkney. And I was actually approached by a member of the Orkney Trout Fishing Association to show pictures today of surveys that they've been doing themselves as volunteers to monitor the health of wild fish in Orkney waters. And there's some strong concerns that the numbers of sea lice per individual wild fish seem to be increasing drastically. So we need to ask questions about that. And the evidence has been provided by members of the community on a voluntary basis. And just very briefly to finish off on seagrass, we've been very fortunate to get funding from Highland Park Whisky Company to allow Heriot Watt students to survey the biodiversity of Orcadian seagrass meadows. And this year we will also be having volunteers from the Orkney community to hand pick ripe seeds from the healthy seagrass meadows to replant and restore the Firth of Forth coastline, to mitigate against coastal erosion, to stabilise sediment, to improve water quality and to sustain local livelihoods. And this is something we can do because our habitats are in good shape. So, this is my final slide. What I would like to say is that we've got areas of healthy and productive habitats which support ecosystem services and local livelihoods. And you can see the range of habitats that they are. And I've highlighted in bold here damage to and loss or fragmentation of these habitats equals loss of ecosystem services that they provide for the benefit and sustenance of the local community. And authentic empowerment of local communities is helping. And it can be further leveraged to preserve these habitats, the ecosystem services, and ultimately the associated sustainable livelihoods. And just to acknowledge there a whole list of people who've helped in this work. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Jo, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. We could have a whole conference in the marine environment.
Indeed.
Are there any quick questions? Yes, please. Oh, we just need a mic. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a quick question around, you said that you looked at seabeds, and what I want to ask is that always a manual process where divers go in and, or is it any part of robotics or computing or digital imaging that goes into the process?
Yep.
If you may expand on that.
I will expand on that. Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. So it really depends on the depth of the water as to which kind of approach we would take. If it's shallow, we can actually do it by snorkeling or even by looking through a bucket with glass in the bottom. If it's a little deeper, we can do it with the divers and using video cameras. But when it gets beyond that, we have to use drop-down cameras and sometimes even acoustic methods to get the information we need. But certainly there's room for expansion of using robotic systems or systems that can reach the areas that we can't reach with what I call the thinking diver. So you don't get the same kind of information back as you do by putting a diver in, but you can certainly get useful information back, and you could cover a large area with robotic systems. And I hope we will see a lot more of that going forwards. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, well, that's brilliant. Now I'm delighted to say we've got Rosie Alexander, who's based at the University of West Scotland, where I carried out my degree, so I'm delighted to have someone at the University of West Scotland here. And Rosie, I gather you're working on a book at the moment and a sense of place. So
yes.
we may hear something about that, but you're going to talk about Scottish Islands and youth migration. So over to you.
I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So yes, so thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the RSE for the opportunity to speak and for putting on this event. It's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to all come together and talk about a diverse range of topics. So I'm Rosie. I work for the University of the West of Scotland. I live in Orkney, and many of you will know me because I live in Orkney rather than through my academic work. So it's really nice to be able to share something of my academic work here. And I'm going to talk about the Scottish Islands and youth migration. There we go. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to thinking about youth migration, how we think about it, often in relation to the islands. Then I'm going to look at some of the evidence around youth migration, what we know about it. I'm going to draw on my own work and the work of others in that section. Then I'm going to suggest some ways that we can reconceptualise youth mobilities in the islands. And then I'm going to look at some implications for policy and practice from that reconceptualisation. And hopefully there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. So starting off then with the youth migration problem in inverted commas. What I've done here on this slide is I've drawn off two charts from the islands, I forget what it's called, like a islands dashboard from the National Records of Scotland. The chart on the left shows the Scottish Islands population by age group, and on the right, mainland Scotland population by age group. And I've just circled there what would be often discussed as the youth gap, the population gap for young people between the ages of 16 to 44 in this presentation, although it's been discussed differently in different publications. Sometimes the age banding is a bit lower than 44, it's down to 35 or so. But you can see here that these two bars, 16 to 24 and 25 to 44, are relatively lower than they are in mainland Scotland, and that causes concerns around longer term population sustainability, the question of an ageing population and have we got enough people who are going to be workers to support that ageing population. Now, this has been a concern for years, decades. A lot of time this has been a concern. And there's been a lot of research in it, a lot of policy publications related to youth migration. The reference here to Crow 2010 is a literature review which looked at what we know from the various publications. A lot of the research that's already been done looks at key drivers of outmigration and of in-migration. The key drivers of outmigration are typically understood to be employment and education. And the key drivers of in-migration for young people and staying behaviour would be quality of life and family and relationship. And I would say in the more recent literature we're seeing an increasing focus on housing as well as a really significant issue in young people's mobilities. So broadly that's the kind of discourse that we see in this area. And I've got an extract there from Scotland's National Population Strategy which just shows how these things are being discussed often in the policy literature. So this quotation talks about how some of the communities in Scotland are facing depopulation as people move to larger towns and cities for employment and education. Migration is heavily concentrated amongst younger people, leading to increasingly ageing populations. So you can see there a really clear articulation of one of the challenges really around youth migration. So I'm going to try and dig a bit deeper than that, and I'm going to look at some of the evidence in this area. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence from my own work. So my PhD looked at the career routes, the migration routes of young people from Orkney and Shetland who entered higher education. And they could have gone anywhere, studied anywhere, but they had to have lived in Orkney or Shetland before they went to university. I interviewed them at the point of graduation and then 1 year later. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm also going to draw on other work. So the first thing I want to cover is that the literature shows that aspirations to leave rural areas are often associated with wanting to go to an urban place. So it's not necessarily strictly education opportunities or employment opportunities, it's wanting to go to an urban community and maybe to have more opportunities generally, opportunities to socialise, opportunities to go to different places, to try different things. It's been discussed as the metrocentricity of youth. That's a phrase from Ferrugia, who works in Australia. Doris Beck in northern Norway has talked about something very similar. And in rural communities, this can be accentuated for young people because of the association with independence and leaving home and leaving what has been described as the scrutiny of a small rural community. So you get to go away and try different stuff, and you haven't got people who you know around you kind of watching you do that. The really important thing here is that not all young people are aspiring to leave or to leave permanently. So some young people don't necessarily want to leave. They might just want to have experiences on the mainland. And other young people might want to go for a certain amount of time and then come back or go to another rural area, for example. This is a quotation from one of my participants in the PhD, very clearly articulating, I think, that when you live in a small place, there is an opportunity to go away when you're 18, and you go away and you can kind of explore things a little bit. And there's a time when you're meant to be going. That's what's interesting in this quotation, I think. You do it at a certain point of time. It's not necessarily forever. The next really important thing, I think, in the literature around youth migration is that mobility practice, what young people actually do, how they move, is not closely, or doesn't hold a strict relationship with their aspirations or how they feel about a community. So young people can want to leave but find it difficult to know how to leave. Young people can want to stay but feel they have to leave. When you look at the literature, there's much clearer evidence around leaving being associated with higher education than there is for leaving for other reasons, particularly in the younger, they're sort of 16 to 20, that kind of bracket. The younger young people, if you like. So I've just completed a small research project actually looking at young people's social connections in Orkney and in Highland region. And if you ask people who stays and who leaves and why, young people will say, you leave to go to university, you stay for family reasons. So leaving is heavily associated with entering higher education, and there's much less clear evidence about other things. Higher education, though, is not necessarily the motivator here. Sometimes it is the means for mobility. Because moving away is difficult. You have to find accommodation, you have to find a job or something to do, you have to make friends. Whereas going away for higher education, that's a facilitated form of mobility. You get support to apply for university, there's a certain amount of financial support, there's accommodation often provided by your university, you're often moving with a group of young people. So it becomes, as in the previous slide's quotation, an opportunity for mobility. The other thing that's sometimes missed, I think, in the way that we think about higher education is that the range of higher education courses is vast. And sometimes in the policy literature, we can run the risk, I think, of thinking about higher education as if it's one thing, as if all degrees are the same thing, they all lead to the same kinds of opportunities. My background is as a careers advisor. I know that for the different careers that you might want to enter, there are sometimes very specific qualifications that you can only get in certain places. And in the islands, what's interesting is that a lot of the jobs or careers that you might see around you, some of those involve qualifications which are difficult to get in your communities. So these are classically healthcare and education. It's quite common in the literature around rural careers that healthcare and education are quite common aspirations. Those qualifications are not always offered in island communities. Now, there has been some change since I did my PhD, and UHI does offer a route into teaching, for example. But things like becoming a GP, a lot of specialist health professions would require qualifications which are you'd probably have to get elsewhere. This quote, very clear from one of my participants in my PhD, aspired to be a nurse, the opportunity to enter nursing means you need to go away. Going away is part of a planned process of return, and in fact they don't really, in some of the literature they talk about it as leaving but not really leaving. They go away to university but they plan to come back for placements and they want to come back more permanently in the end. If we think about mobility as related to higher education, often the other thing that's really important is that we know in the higher education literature generally that graduates are not always a highly mobile population. A lot of them return to family homes. It's not always for positive reasons. So sometimes difficulty finding work or difficulty accessing cheap accommodation, I guess, would mean that they would return to live with family as a cost-effective choice. But a lot of young people who go on to higher education return, and in island communities there are very strong patterns of return. So in my research I looked at 5 years worth of data for all graduates, first degree, full-time undergraduates from Orkney and Shetland. For that 5 years of data, over a third of graduates are back in the island 6 months after graduation. And that's kind of surprised me when I came across it. We also know about patterns of return in other island communities, so Sardinia, Faroe Islands, the Azores. All of these communities have had research where they talk about patterns of return, rooted mobilities, rotational mobilities. In the Faroe Islands, it's been described as a culture of return. And the last points here are just that return mobilities can be experienced positively or negatively, and the way that young people are moving after they've completed a degree is related to their relationships and to the career structures of the careers that they are in. So if you have a partner in the islands, you're more likely to return. If your partner comes from somewhere else, you're less likely to return. If you have family who have care needs, for example, you might choose to return. Career structures, there's a kind of paradox here that sometimes when you follow a very clear career pathway into a specific vocation, like nursing or teaching or other healthcare careers, there's not always an opportunity to return to the islands at the point of graduation. You might need to remain away to continue in your training and potentially wait in order to come home. Other pathways involve working your way up, so a lot of graduates go into more general pathways. Sometimes those pathways require a lot of experience, sometimes not very well paid, and those students can struggle to access that kind of experience in a way where they have enough money to be able to afford to live elsewhere. So depending on your career pathway, you might find you're more likely to come home or not. I'm not going to talk about this in any depth, but it's a sort of typology that I created about returners to island communities, showing that some come home and feel very settled very soon after graduation, so this is like a year after graduation. Others come home in a more temporary way, and others feel quite unsettled. They can feel a little bit stuck if they come home and they don't have a relationship and they don't have a good, or they don't perceive the opportunities for a strong career. So, I guess what I'm thinking here is about youth mobility and whether we can reconceptualize it. I'm quite interested in moving beyond these staying and leaving binaries. The idea that people leave because they want to leave and they leave forever. Or the idea that people stay and they stay because they want to stay and they stay forever. I'm interested in moves in this sort of academic literature to move beyond concepts of migration and more to mobility, recognizing that people move in different ways for different amounts of time. So yeah, moving beyond this kind of idea of stayers and leavers. Mobility is sometimes actively desired for young people for a period of time. Sometimes it's necessary. And the other thing that I think is very important here is that mobility is not always equally possible, depending on your resources and your circumstances. So I'm quite interested in this kind of move in some of the literature around island migrations, moving away from ideas of brain drain to ideas of brain rotation, brain circulation, and brain diffusion. The idea that young people do go away, they're not necessarily a loss to the community. Young people can return as well. And I've put a quote on this slide just from somebody who did return to the islands, describes feeling very settled in the islands, but really importantly says, I would never say that that is me home forever now. I might move again. So it really highlights the way that mobilities are sort of negotiated in an ongoing way, and it's not just about staying and leaving decisions at one point in time. So finally then, I'm going to just briefly mention some implications for policy and practice. So I think some of what I've talked about might point to some questions about how we support stayers and returners. So recognising that not all young people stay because they want to stay or return because there's a great job here. How do we support those young people who are already in the islands? And sometimes we miss that when we're focusing on trying to retain young people, because we're focused on what will keep people here rather than how can we support the people who already are here. And I have some thoughts in that area. My background is career guidance. You know, I'm interested in sort of whether there are opportunities to help young people develop positive career pathways in island communities, recognising that they often don't want the best job, but they want a good enough job. The phrase good enough is important. They want opportunities where they can feel engaged. They've got an opportunity for self-development, for growth. They feel like they're doing something meaningful. They need to earn a certain amount as well, but often the quality of job is very important. Supporting island leavers to remain connected to the islands and potentially to return. This isn't a new point, but it's one that is often overlooked, I think, that we could focus more on how we support young people to return, recognising that some will go away. How do we return them, help them to return? Here, I think there are some very interesting international examples. Many years ago, I was in the Faroe Islands speaking about some of this stuff, and I was told that in the Faroe Islands they have a careers fair that they run at Christmas time. And they run it at Christmas time because that's when young people go back to their families for their Christmas holidays. And it's just a completely different way of thinking about what we're doing. This is another point, I think, reducing barriers to mobility. So it's sort of the opposite of some of the ways that we might often think. So in helping young people to access opportunities elsewhere, particularly those who might benefit from or want to go away for a period of time or take on an additional qualification or whatever. And also reducing the barriers to mobility for those to remain connected to the islands who've left. I've put this in here partly because this is the thing that the students say directly to me. They say directly, we need more support for young people to reduce the costs of travel and then reduce the challenges of travel home. And the last point touches on some of the points earlier about recognising issues of scale and island diversity. So actually the population levels of like Scottish Islands are relatively stable as a whole, but we have some larger islands like Orkney Mainland, Shetland Mainland that have growing populations. We have smaller islands which are still very vulnerable. And so these same issues are important to island young people from the smaller islands, but there's maybe an even more critical set of questions that we need to ask about our smaller islands. And just as an example, I did have one of the things that was said to me in my PhD from somebody from one of the outer islands was that, of course, they couldn't get home for a weekend because there's 2 planes or 2 boats or whatever. So, like, we have to recognise issues of scale. Different islands are different, and smaller islands face some different kinds of challenges. I'm not going to talk about this, but I do have a book. I have a couple of books coming out. There's a book from my PhD there. We've got book launch about higher education in small islands, which is a recent book. Contact details. I'm very happy to speak to anybody about this topic. It's my favourite topic. And a new network that I'm part of as well. So welcome any questions.
That's absolutely brilliant. Any questions? Yes, there's one, 2 at the back. Yes, lady first.
Hello. I'm an Arcadian that went away and came back. A lot of my friends that went to uni at the same time as me didn't graduate from the degree they went to do, came back early, and I wondered if any of your research kind of looked at folk who didn't graduate but returned to their island home.
So my research didn't look at that. because I specifically needed to recruit people who had graduated. I recruited them at the point of graduation. And the statistical data sets almost all relate to people who actually graduate. So a lot of what we know about students, higher education students, comes from data about graduates or about the point at which people enter higher education. We have very little data about people who don't graduate. But it's something that certainly I'm aware of and has been discussed, between my friends and in the island community of young people who go away and then don't complete their degree courses and return. I had a couple of students in my PhD for whom that was the case. I think it was a couple who had then subsequently gone on to higher education but through a different route. One of the interesting things I think in this research for me is the complexity of pathways through higher education, which is often underestimated in the literature too.
Thank you. Got a question there, and then we've got an online question.
I suppose I refer to the serial incomer to what we so there we are. We mentioned briefly at the beginning housing and how that was playing into this. Does the increasing difficulty for young people to actually own their own house, either in the islands or anywhere else, that comes to that, is that having any kind of noticeable or researched effect on the patterns of mobility you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's adding a lot of complexity. So it's complicated because obviously there's housing challenges in the islands, but there's also housing challenges elsewhere. So it would be difficult to say that it's having a direct impact one way or another, and I'm not sure I know of any literature that would say that, but certainly there's somebody, I think Cardiff University has pointed out that the complexities of housing transitions, as they are getting more complex, alongside the complexity of career transitions, creates this really challenging set of circumstances for young people. And it can have slightly interesting effects. So there's some question, for example, about whether certain cities that are not London are becoming more popular amongst graduates because they have lower house prices. Yes, but it's a very important topic. It has a direct impact on young people's mobilities, but it's difficult to say exactly how it impacts.
Thank you. And now we have an online question.
Yes, a question from online. I'm asking, do many people return to take on caregiver roles for elderly parents? And is that a global trend? And if so, are organisations obliged or should be obliged to grant work from home arrangements?
So many parts of that question, and really interesting. Yes, caring responsibilities, I think, are... So again, there's some literature which has looked at later return mobilities, so parents were a reason for return, and that's really underestimated in the youth migration literature, the caring relationships and responsibilities that young people feel. And the question about remote working, yeah, I think return for caring responsibilities can pose a lot of challenges and lead people to have to renegotiate their career position, either with their current employers or change their career direction entirely. I would certainly like to see more flexibility around the ability to work from home.
Brilliant. Yes, and one more question. Yes. Thanks, Becky.
Yeah, you showed the graph earlier on with the different distribution between island, age distribution for island and for mainland. Is that a danger that you look at that and say that's a problem, whereas it's not necessarily a problem, it's maybe the right distribution for an island, and it's about supporting people to leave and come back, as opposed to trying to change the distribution?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what I'm interested in. Like, actually, it's not necessarily a problem if you've got young people coming in, returning, and also young people coming in. So I think we often miss that. When we focus on youth outmigration as the problem, we focus on trying to do things to retain young people, rather than thinking about actually how can we help young people to return, and what about incomers? What about young people who want to come here from other communities?
Thank you very much. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Great, and great to see these plugs for the book. Delighted now to have Donna. We'll get you set up. Whatever's easiest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just delighted to say, in introducing Donna, she'll be very well known to most of you here, but I'm especially pleased to say that Donna this year was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I think the first Fellow, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who was a staff member from the University of the Highlands and Islands. So,
first female.
First female, fantastic. So brilliant to have you on board, Donna. I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Des. I hope you can all hear me. We have to have this bingo card of statements when we start using technology. I'd just like to say Whatlike, Fescarma, and good afternoon to everybody in the room and everybody out there in the ether as well. You're very, very welcome. Now, I've called this presentation Rising Tides, and rising tides, of course, refers to climatic change and the danger for all island archipelagos of the rising waters. But I'm also thinking about another kind of rising tide, and that's the rising tide of cultural tourism visitors, including the cruise industry. Those waves break on these islands too, and they ebb away and they leave detritus behind. So that's some of the things I'm going to be talking about. What I'm going to do, as I nip speedily through a vast amount of information in the next 20 minutes, is I'm going to look at the context for tourism now. I'm going to talk about cultural tourism, the benefits and the disadvantages. I'm going to ask what questions should we be asking as we look to the future for tourism. I'm also going to very quickly do a couple of brief case studies, Orkney and Vanuatu, where I've been working. And I'm going to have some thoughts on the future. And I too will be raising issues which I may not answer, like Joanne. Right. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. Getting overexcited with wanting to share my slides there. Okay, so the world has changed, folks. We're in a very different world from where we were 5 years ago. And for tourism, it is one of the things that's most greatly affected by that in so many ways. In lots of places across the world, tourism is a strategic pillar industry. It's always had increasingly significant contributions to make to the local gross domestic product. Despite this importance, though, tourism is also one of the most vulnerable industries for all sorts of reasons. The tourism industry has experienced significant negative effects during crisis events, such as the financial crises in 1997, in 2008, the SARS epidemic, and forecasts generated using traditional methods are very often out of date and ineffective in a crisis. And of course, since late 2019, the coronavirus disease pandemic has caused unprecedented global health and social emergencies and profound negative impacts on the global economy. And the knock-on effects of the pandemic in different countries and territories have been devastating. Especially in terms of human suffering and deaths and so on, but also lost jobs and lost earnings. Lockdown, and the good thing that came out of lockdown really was that people started to think very differently about well-being and about how they articulated with communities and articulated with their environment. But a 2020 estimate calculated that the economic impact of the pandemic on worldwide travel and tourism is 5 times more compared to that of the 2008 global financial crisis. And of course, governments have had to think about this now. They've had to respond. Rather than being reactive and sticking plasters on things, they've had to take a proactive approach to what they're going to do for the tourist industry. And we've had to look more self-consciously and more proactively at the sector than ever before. So just to give you some kind of ideas here, at the combined level, the higher the weight of the tourism sector in a country's GDP, the higher the estimated economic cost for these crises. For example, Greece and Portugal, Mexico and Spain, where tourism constitutes more than 15% of their GDP, a baseline scenario is that it's cost them between 5.2 and 6.2% of their GDP. That doesn't sound like very much, but it translates to billions. And we suffer from that. We've suffered from that here at all. But we know that tourism was growing exponentially up until the arrival of COVID, and the nature of travel changed. Now, I just want to say a little thing about that there too, is that the nature of what people were looking for from tourism changed as well. People come to Scotland for the culture in many ways. They do not come to lie on a beach unless there's something wrong with them. Right? That is not what they're doing. And Scotland, in many ways, is not just a geographical location, it is a temporal one. It is a place to go back in the past. And Orkney is the apogee of that. if you like. It harnesses all these things. And yes, I'm about to flash up a slide with Orkney, the Orkney quote that Antonia used earlier on, but it's true enough. So we're dealing with a kind of quality tourism product. And this is the way forward for tourism, generally speaking, the quality products. The cheaper tourism experiences are no longer as viable as they were because of constraints in the aviation industry, various other factors there. So we're talking about that. So cultural tourism has become even more popular because of this interest in well-being, this re-evaluation, this self-conscious understanding of what we're looking for from these experiences. So it's grown a lot in recent years, and it has changed in how people function as consumers. Research has shown that people are more interested now in experiences, in bragging rights. Oh, I found this lovely cheese down a track someplace. You know, of course you've not got that. You've not had that experience. But it does mean that we need to understand what cultural tourism means if we are to build on it, ask the right questions, and get the right result for Orkney and indeed good old Vanuatu, which is a splendid place. So, in an attempt to understand the scope of cultural tourism, in academia we've been developing a number of typologies, usually based upon the tourist level of motivation. Bywater in 1993 differentiated tourists according to whether they were culturally interested, culturally motivated, or culturally inspired. So what does that mean? Culturally interested tourists demonstrate a general interest in culture and consume cultural attractions casually as part of a holiday, rather than consciously planning it. Oh, there's the Italian chapel, think we'll have a look at that, right? Whereas culturally motivated tourists consume culture as a major part of the trip, but do not choose their destination on the basis of specific cultural experiences, where for culturally inspired tourists, that's the main point of the holiday. So we have that. A more complex typology was prepared by McKercher, and he divides the cultural tourists into 4 different varieties. The purposeful cultural tourist, for whom cultural tourism is the primary motive for travel. They want to have a very deep cultural experience. The second category is the sightseeing cultural tourist, for whom cultural tourism is a primary reason for visiting a destination, but the experience is more shallow in nature. The serendipitous cultural tourist does not travel for cultural reasons, but after participating ends up having a deep tourism cultural experience, while the casual cultural tourist is weakly motivated by culture and subsequently has a more shallow experience. And then there's what's called the incidental cultural tourist, the one who doesn't travel for cultural tourism reasons, but nonetheless participates in the activities surrounding it and has a fairly surface experience to that. So cultural tourism is very important for many reasons. And one of the most prominent reasons is the social impact that it brings. Cultural tourism can help reinforce identities. It can enhance cross-cultural understanding and preserve the heritage and culture of an area. I'll come back to that because there's disadvantages too. It can have positive economic impacts. Tourists who visit an area to learn more about a culture or who want to visit cultural attraction things such as museums or shows during their trip help to contribute, of course, to the economy of the area. Otherwise, why would we do it? They do that. And attractions have to be staffed, bringing with them employment opportunities, and tertiary businesses can also benefit, such as restaurants, taxi firms, and we heard Chris's experience with his taxi driver this morning, and we come back to that taxi driver later on, and of course hotels and so on. Furthermore, for those seeking a really deep cultural experience, options such as staying in somebody's home or having that experience on a farm can have positive economic benefits to the members of the community themselves who are hosting the tourists. And I think one of the most important benefits, and I would say this because I'm in education, is the educational aspect, is the understanding. Tourists and hosts alike can learn about different ways of life, so we can teach them, we can learn from them, and this is when I talk about my case study in a wee minute, to explain what happened between Orkney and Vanuatu in that extent. And learning things, having the capacity and the desire to learn is a very positive quality in a human being. I would have to say it's something I feel very strongly that we should all have. Okay, so there we go. So there are a range of impacts, of course, resulting from cultural tourism activities, both good and bad. So the positive impacts of cultural tourism are revitalisation of culture and art. People start taking an interest in their culture and art and so on if somebody else wants to come and have a look at it. So that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. Some destinations encourage local cultures and arts to be revitalised, might be in the form of a museum exhibition or in the way that the restaurants and shops are decorated, what's on the t-shirts, quite important, although I'd have to say, frankly, some of the runic inscriptions and t-shirts here are likely to put me over the edge at some point or another. And also the entertainment that's on offer, and this can help promote traditions that may have become distant, but that becomes difficult. And as we'll see with Vanuatu, they have the issue there that they are now performing rituals at the wrong time to suit the cruise industry. So how echt is that? Not very, I would argue. But we have to think about the preservation of heritage too. As tourists come to places like Orkney, specifically for the local heritage. And that sometimes encourages the powers that be in a destination to make more efforts to preserve that local heritage, because it is now of value. It was always of value, but it's now of monetary value. And this includes things like putting restrictions in place or limiting tourist numbers if necessary, for example, if you're going to go to St Kilda. And this is a good example of careful tourism planning and sustainable tourism management. Well, the negative impacts, and any taxi driver taking you anywhere in Orkney will without doubt mention these. It can be things like social change. Social change basically referring to changes in the way that society acts or behaves. There was a very funny letter to the Arcadian one time saying that perhaps women should all get their hair done when the cruise ships are in, and men should stand about in clean boiler suits, because that's their Orkney national dress. But of course there are changes, because we have roads that are shut off, streets that are shut off when the cruise ships are in and so on. So we can see the social change there. There's an awful lot of examples throughout the world. I'm not going to just now, of where local populations have changed their way of working, if you like. For example, in Bali, tourists wander right through the temples at all times, all sorts of things. There is nothing taboo at all. And that's not really the way forward, I don't think. We also have globalization and the destruction of heritage and so on. Got my notes thrown around here. Oh, here we are. So globalization is the way in which the world is becoming increasingly connected. We're losing our individuality and gaining a sense of global being, if you like, where we become more and more alike than ever before. It's inevitable in the tourist industry because of the interaction between tourists and hosts, and they come from different places and they find their common ground. They find the bit that they understand. We also have a similar issue, which is standardization and commercialization. Destinations can risk standardization by conforming to what tourists are expecting. Having just come off a cruise ship full of American tourists, I can testify to this, that they're wanting a certain recognizable substrate in their tourism experience as well. The right kind of, the food, that kind of thing. They're wanting a recognized experience there. So that can rub off some of the individuality and the things that make the cultural tourism experience so exciting. And of course we also have loss of authenticity, as I'm just saying about Vanuatu. That's an example there. When I was in Vanuatu, there was we saw something that was done for the cruise ships, and then we travelled through the jungle with a machete, I'm not joking, to end up in a village on another island where they were absolutely living the life. And you had to go at certain times, and there were certain places that you weren't allowed to go, and the difference was startling. But sometimes we have to do it. And then, of course, culture clashes, people's behaviour. And that's something that's probably worthy of a lecture on its own, I think. So, and we also have the issue with tourist-host relationships. People do get exasperated by fundamental differences there. And there are many examples of ways that tourists can offend the local population, but I'll come to that in a minute. So 2 sets of notes here. There we are. So what can we do about it? If we've been thinking about these things reflectively, is there any guidance? Well, yes, there is, thanks to the UN. And this is the guidance that they're giving as part of their tourism framework about preserving the policies and activities should be conducted with respect. They should preserve things. They should make things accessible. So respect, preservation, and accessibility. But there are questions here that are not being answered, such as accountability, responsibility, and so on. We'll come back to those. All right. So we have these issues. So how do we implement this slightly vague guidance? I mean, it's lovely, but it's a bit vague. So how do we implement it? Well, first of all, We start looking at the advantages and disadvantages there. We start looking at where the UN Sustainable Development Goals can be applied so that we have some heft in what we're doing. We're tying into things. And we need to, when we're doing that, we need to ask these questions. What do tourists actually want? Mind you, I've spent a whole career on telling people what they want when they didn't realise it. So sometimes people, you know, they don't know what they want until you tell them. That is very, very true. So what do the tourists actually want? What do they want to experience? Other questions, how much and what to share? What should we be allowing people access to? Slightly, there's a different case in Orkney than Vanuatu there as well. How can we empower communities? That's extremely important. And again, empowerment and ownership are fundamental to the future of cultural tourism. Without that, the people will not have a say in that. Without our own voice, we cannot speak for ourselves. So it's very important that we keep up with that. And how can we preserve our environments? Here in Orkney, of course, as we all know, we have the issue with so many tourists coming. We have the issue of erosion because they're all coming to look at the same thing, all of these things. So these are the questions that I feel that we really need to be asking and we need to be answering as soon as we can. Who do we ask? Well, I think we ask everybody. It's the tour operators, the tour guides, the indigenous communities, the tourists, and the other stakeholders. Well, Joanne was saying in her presentation, who's responsible and who's going to pay for it? Well, these are the people we need in the debate right away from the beginning when we're planning these things. And planning has taken place. We do have a tourism strategy in Orkney. They're writing one in Vanuatu. But we're looking at things differently now because we're looking at a different future with different priorities. Before it was very much bums on seats. And now we're looking at the quality of the tourism experience and the quality of the experience for the people in these islands. Because after all, somebody should ask us what we want. What kind of tourism industry do we want? Okay? So that's who we target. Otherwise, we're going to face this, which is perhaps the most fabulously named diagram in the world. Doxy's Irritation Index. And this maps what happens, the volume of tourists against feelings. You start off feeling euphoric, people are coming, how fabulous. Then, oh, by tourists, right? Irritation, oh, I can't get parked in Broad Street. Antagonism, well, this is ridiculous, look at the muck they're leaving everywhere, and we can't get any peace, and decent, respectable, ordinary tourists. So there we have that. So I love that. And it works both ways, because the tourists feel like that as well. Too many tourists is not what necessarily, if they're looking for a cultural tourism experience, this is not what they're wanting. So that is Doxy's Irritation Index. We take nothing away from my presentation today apart from that. That's what if you're naming things, that's what you want to talk about. So conscious of time, so I just want to nip on and talk a little bit very briefly about Orkney and Vanuatu. And yes, indeed, I do have that quote up there as well. And Orkney does have a particular identity. It's always had a very strong identity. It's the end of the known world in antiquity. It's not the unknown. It's the end of the Roman Empire. That might surprise some of you. It certainly would have surprised the folk in Orkney if they'd known about it, because they never got here. But it has a particular identity. It's got a very strong tourism industry. It's had a lot of support from the government, so on and so forth. But there are issues, and a lot of the issues are to do with the volume of cruise ships. Now, in an extraordinary happening, there is not a cruise ship out there, which is... So I've got pictures. To give you a sense of what we can see, there was 3 cruise ships in that picture there. That is not an uncommon thing, right? There's a really massive one, and you can see the St Magnus Cathedral there, and there's another couple there. So this is what happens during the summer months, from April to October. As most people in this room know, this is what happens, and we are overrun with tourists. And one of the questions I ask about the Orkney tourist experience is, if you're going somewhere spiritual, like the Italian chapel, and there's 8 buses of tourists there, how spiritual an experience is that? You know, so it does shape and change the tourism experience, the volume. So the volume is an issue. This rising tide is an issue for us. And when I started working with tourism in Orkney, we started off training up the tourist guides, things as part of our community development. We were very keen that people got things right, because that's another thing that's important in cultural tourism. You have to be accurate. That's what people want. They want the real facts. They don't want some old rubbish about something else. So it's very important to get that right. And it's very important for local people, by which I mean old and New Yorkerians alike, people who can contribute to that story, who know what they're talking about. So it's extremely important we get that right. So we really enjoyed, it's 10 years, no, it's 14 years now since we started training tourist guides, and that was in response actually to a request from Orkney Harbours, who discovered that although Orkney is the top cruise port in Britain, people weren't disembarking. And there was a good reason for that, because we didn't have language guides. So we trained up the Scottish Tour Guides Association guides in 6 languages in the first year, which was very impressive. And we had a lovely statistic for one of our REF case studies in 2014 about how many people actually got off the boat after that. Excellent stuff. So Orkney has the concerns here with sustainability, with volume of visitors, with erosion of sites, with the fact that everybody wants to come and see the same thing. It's very difficult to, there's been lots of plans to try and get people to look at the Viking sites, but you see the Vikings were too busy going about doing stuff to create big monuments. Even their parliaments weren't a building, they were a conflict resolution meeting where they took their boats and then went away again. So it's actually quite difficult, but that's a question we have to address. So just very briefly about Vanuatu. Okay, where is it? I thought it would be helpful. I do like a map, folks. And so that's where Vanuatu is. It's actually a completely useless piece of information, but you never know when it might come in handy for the quiz league. It is the most Presbyterian country in the world. So I set off in 2017 with my colleague Alex Sandmark to look at the tourism industry in Vanuatu, and it became very apparent that they had no structure at all. We started off going to do work on evaluating their strategy. We ended up creating a tourism qualification for them because they were being exploited, they were being paid really badly. The Chinese, we heard the Chinese mentioned in Joe's presentation, have taken over in Vanuatu. They basically build huge resorts and they give the community a dirt road and a one-room corrugated iron shack for a school as their community involvement. So we've been upskilling them, getting them trained up so they have an internationally recognised qualification. But some of the issues in Vanuatu, just some more nice pictures for you to look at there. Very beautiful place. If anybody's had a mother who liked musicals as mine did, that's where South Pacific was set. But in the tourism industry, they don't do anything with that. They just show you the bit where the Americans dropped their fridges into the water. When they left, it's called Millionaire's Point. Whereas the house of James Michener, who wrote the book on which South Pacific is based, is in ruins. Anyway, oh yes, moving on there. So some of the issues they have is the really bad planning. Do you see that building there? That is the handicrafts place. That was on a day. Why is that moving? That's very strange. Technology hates me. Hold on, I'll just come back. I might have to hold my finger on this. But that is the handicrafts hall, which is a 2-story building on the day when the cruise ships are in. Why is there nobody in there? Because they built it on the wrong side of the port. Everybody comes off the cruise ship and goes that way. The building is there. Other things. They're determined with this. Other things are that they do not want to talk about their cultural heritage. These 2 figures here, they were selling them individually. It took us 2 weeks to get somebody to tell us that they're actually a pair, and I think not to put too fine a point on it, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that. They're a pair, and what they are is that they stay in the house and look after the house when you're out. How saleable is that? And yes, that is my set from the front room here in Kirkwall. So getting them to understand what in Orkney, people understand their heritage. They understand what's of value is very important. Oh, I'm going to give up, just do that there. Other things is what's called custom, which is about certain places are taboo. Now, this is a handwritten note from the chief saying that you can't use his swimming place unless you pay him money. Because it's, right, that's the last slide, I'm just giving up now. You need to give him money, right? They also have 110 indigenous languages, as well as English, French, and Bislama, which is a kind of Creole, which they all learnt when they were taken away to be slaves into sugar plantations in Queensland. Rather delightfully non-rhotic, unlike Scots with their good sound. So when something's broken, it's described as gone bugger up. I'll leave you to put the R in there yourselves. There we go. So they had issues of perceptions of the value of their heritage. They had issues that they were being exploited, and so on and so forth. So we've worked very hard to change that. And the important thing there is the ownership aspect there. The communities having charge and responsibility of their own heritage and how they present it. So I've got 4 cornerstones, and it's my last slide. Hope I'm all right for time there, Desmond. Right? It's what we need to be thinking about. Sustainability, most important. We have to live in these environments. We need to make sure that we are preserving them. And I don't mean in aspect. Sometimes people who complain about things seem to want to make everything stay the same forever, but preserve it in the right way. And I think I was saying to somebody earlier how much I love the landscape in Orkney, where something like Maze House got sheep on the top of it. You know, it's not a museum, it's just part of the landscape. So sustainability, accountability, whose responsibility is this? Who are the people who should be paying for this? I mean, there have been a lot of interesting initiatives being talked about recently, a levy tax on cruise ships. The Islands Plan has got various aspects of tourism in it. I'm on the Scottish Government group for that. And there's also, of course, the Islands Deal, where the heart of Neolithic Orkney, and the issue of sustainability and the issue of trying to move that volume, of people round about is fundamental. So that's great, we're seeing that. Whose responsibility is it? Who should have the responsibility for it? Should it be the Islands Council? Should it be the Scottish Government? Should it be a body created to look after these things in Orkney, as they're trying to do in Vanuatu now? They're trying to create something that's going to take responsibility. And finally, ownership, as I've been saying all along. The important thing is to make sure that our cultural heritage is presented in the way that we want, to the level that we want, and to make sure that we get the benefits from it and we can enjoy and value it. Because coming to see a land is fine. A land without people and culture and heritage is a desert. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Donna. Any questions, comments?
There's an online one as well.
There's an online. I'll take the online question first, if that's all right.
Okay, the online question was, how would an island community minimise the carbon footprint of tourist travel, or would that deter big spenders burning through their cash when they get here?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Well, minimising the carbon footprint is quite a difficult thing to do because there's such a volume. People tend not to fly into Orkney. There's a good reason for that, because it's very, very expensive. So maybe keeping the airfares high is a good idea. We do have issues with this with the cruise ships, for example, and the pollutants and all sorts of things like that. The thing to do is perhaps to manage the number of cruise ships that come in and balance, because there's no doubt that having 3 in one day is too much for the infrastructure. So there's only so many buns that people can eat. There's only so many buns that are available for them to eat, that kind of thing. So it's a question really of managing the expectations there, understanding what we want in terms of tourism volume.
Thank you. And then we've got a question corner.
Thank you. Hi there. Hi. I'm just Cheryl Chapman, Visit Scotland Development Manager. So very interested to hear that, and I recognise a lot of what you're saying. But I do want to say that there is, in terms of the questions you're posing and what we need to do, that is very much being recognised in local strategy, the Orkney tourism strategy, but in every, strategy, the national strategy Outlook 2030. So it is definitely, there front and centre of every agenda, this sustainability. And for Visit Scotland, the 4 S's is spread, spend rather than, that's a value over volume, sustainability, and satisfaction, which is about that local community. Is tourism improving the destination? We know great places make great destinations. So I think all of that narrative is there. I agree there's still a long way to go in sort of doing that. And so the big question is how? And I think there is a sort of leadership vacuum there as to who is carrying this forward. Council has a role because of the infrastructure and they're putting in all those places. Anyway, so I'm coming to a question around the tourism levy, which you touched on. Is it a good thing?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Of course it's a good thing. Because it happens in other places. Why should there not be a levy on that can offset some of the damage that's done and provide funding to shore up, quite literally, shore up places? So yes, I'm all for it.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
Every time someone crosses a dock, we pay landing dues. If we leave any port in Orkney and go to Caithness, we pay landing dues in Caithness, it's incorporated in the ticket. So there is a levy there already. If you go to the airport, The airport's not for free. You pay. There's probably something in the train station. There's something in every bus station. So this tourist levy thing, we need to get a better handle and definition on it.
Yeah, I'm
Because
seeing
this is like the silver bullet everyone's waiting for, but I mean it's tax on tax.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you there, because the landing charges are one thing, they're for entering a place. What we're talking about is the equivalent, if you like, of nights spent or time spent in a particular destination.
Yeah, but everyone's a tourist, and a tourist not a tourist. I mean, if people are taking this for a funeral.
Okay, carry on with this conversation after all, because we are running out of time. Donna, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Round of applause. Now, first of all, apologies for the heating in here, but we're almost there. 2 talks to go. We've now got an online presentation, and I'm just checking. It's Paul Walton, who's head of Habitats and Species in the RSPB, who's spent a lot of time in the Northern Isles. Becky, I'm just looking at you to see if he's ready to join us.
Paul, we do have Paul on the line. Always the technical issues.
That's okay.
Look at me.
I can confirm that is not Paul.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Wait a minute, have you bypassed the projector? Because the projector's only running off that computer. Right, that computer goes through the projector. This computer goes live. So you by plugging it in here.
Okay.
You need to plug that down there.
Tell you what we'll do, we'll have a leg stretch whilst we sort this out. So just take a time out for 5 minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I think we need to pick the sound up, Becky, from here and put this on the audio on here. Turn the aircon back on as well in case it's too.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just Paul know where sorting out.
He does. We can say you can probably see me now if you want to see.
Hi Paul, can you hear me? It's Des here. Hi, sorry for the techie issues, Paul. Don't worry, we'll get it sorted very quickly.
I can hear it up here, but making it come through here is a different matter. You'd almost have to aim the microphone. Let's do that. So I'll try it.
Just go for Erica now. So we'll just get our presentation.
And Paul's aware of it.
He's fine. Pepper's just going to speak to him and I think we are ready to start or resume. Right. Thanks. Thank you for your patience. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Yep. Thank you for your patience. Unfortunately, the technology's let us down, so what we're going to do is separately we will record Paul Walton's presentation. He's a fantastic speaker, and then we'll make sure we put it online as part of these lectures. So we'll still have an opportunity to hear and see Paul. So I'm now delighted to introduce Erica Knott. Erica, come to the stage. Erica is going to talk about really challenging issues around marine energy and their future. Erica was a colleague of mine. We've been involved in a number of local public inquiries together, fighting various enemies. But Erica, I know you've been nominated as Woman Planner of 2024. Have we got any update on that? Are your nomination still stands?
Well, apparently the whole cohort that were nominated are Women of Influence of 2024.
Hooray! Well, that deserves a round of applause. Without any further ado, Erica Knott.
I'm going to have to try and adjust this microphone because too wee. And slideshow. There we go. That's good. I'm not actually going to do much moving of buttons here. It's going to be pictures, and I'm going to talk. The pictures and me do not relate. I just can't multitask when I'm talking, I'm afraid. And I have to wear my glasses, so it should move on. Is it moving on? Yes, it is moving on. So. Okay, so can everyone hear me okay now? Yeah, good. So good afternoon everyone, I'm delighted to be here. And I thought I was going to be the last of the speakers, but technology aside, I am still the last of the speakers. So I'm hoping I can bring together some of the themes we've been hearing about from the speakers before me. And it's a shame that Paul wasn't able to speak because obviously I am from Nature Scot and seabirds is a big passion of mine as well. So It's a shame, so hopefully you'll be able to see that at a later date. But I'm here to principally talk about marine energy, a relatively new means of how we harness power from the sun, wind and sea to produce electricity for our use. However, as you will be aware from the rich heritage of these islands, humans have been harnessing power for a long time from water mills, whale blubber, peat, hydropower, oil and gas, onshore wind, and now both tidal stream and offshore wind. When the more recent form of commercial onshore wind started 30 years ago, where did it start? It was actually here in Orkney. The testing of these first wind turbines has led the way in Scotland to a significant onshore wind energy industry. The buzz that created also encouraged others to follow, including, importantly, the European Marine Energy Centre based in Stromness, EMEC, as I'll refer to it hereafter. A test centre enabling the production of both tidal stream and wave power. And as you will hear, both the islands and the seas around these islands have a number of accolades for being key drivers and successful test beds to where we are now and where we might go with marine energy. This need to produce renewable energy has never been greater. The impact of climate change is happening around us, increases in storminess and coastal flooding, impacts to habitats and species, marine heat waves, and changes in prey resources, as well as the ever-increasing demand for energy to support our modern lifestyles. We understand better than ever that use of fossil fuels is now limited. Our energy infrastructure, designed in the last century, is also no longer fit for purpose. However, like every new industry, there is the initial enthusiastic rush, think of the gold rush, but we need to carefully design and build to accommodate a new, clean energy system. This will also require a just transition to drive forward the solutions for our climate emergency, as well as sensitively taking cognizance of our natural world and the biodiversity crisis. To help put this all into context, let's identify a few key energy statistics for Scotland and Orkney. So Orkney has been a net producer of renewable energy since 2013. 2013, that's over a decade now, and in 2020 was producing 128% of its electricity needs from renewable sources. In comparison, the rest of Scotland, in 2020, the figure for Scotland was only 62%, so that's almost half of what Orkney's been producing. Orkney has been at the forefront of onshore wind and has added solar, ground source heat pumps, hydrogen production, as well as tidal stream power, and large commercial scale offshore wind farms are now planned east and west of Orkney. This conference provides us with an opportunity to identify current energy production and what the future holds in terms of renewable energy production, the associated grid infrastructure, and other supporting infrastructure. How renewables can help tackle the climate emergency and maintain a rich variety of life to be able to sustain food supplies, water and the air we breathe. Quite often, it is island communities that experience adverse impacts first, and often it is the self-sufficiency, the passion and the expertise of local communities and islands that can help drive forward change that benefit not just you as islanders, but also the wider community of Scotland and beyond. So what are the current issues? We've got changing our use of land and sea when we plan for new renewables. No new industry or project can be implemented without affecting someone or something else, but planning can help alleviate some of those impacts. We have to think about restoring and or protecting habitats. Joe's talk earlier really brought home to you how well endowed and how extraordinary the marine life of Orkney waters are. But we do need to build resilience in species impacted now by climate change, and I'm sure Paul would have talked about that, as well as other anthropogenic activities. We need to mitigate climate change. Renewable energy can and does contribute to a lower carbon economy and brings opportunities for new jobs and skills. And we already heard about the issues around population change within islands. We need to think about reducing pollution. We've got an innovative technology and we're always quick to build, but we're less quick to recycle, reduce the waste, or even understand the implications of our current activities for future generations. And then we've got to get the technology to work. It can be very difficult in a marine environment. And we've also got to manage the intermittent nature of current renewable technologies. Sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't. Tidal cycles are a cycle for that very reason. And we have to think about having the associated infrastructure required, whether that is the reinforcement of the grid, including interconnectors, battery storage, or associated hydrogen production and storage, or some other technologies that we've not yet discovered or thought about. So as you can tell, there are still uncertainties around current activities, and these will increase as we look to the future. Both the UK and Scottish governments have set targets for net zero electricity production by 2050, but Orkney is already well on its way to meeting those targets. However, we do still, and that includes the Orkney Islands, have a reliance on fossil fuels. But here in Orkney, the Flotta oil terminal is still a major employer and key industry, but the operators of that industry are now considering the opportunity to repurpose that facility to become a green hydrogen hub, and in the short term operate both activities on site. But moving back to the here and now, we'll discuss a bit more about tidal stream, wave and offshore wind. So Orkney was first identified to host EMEC in 2001. Initially it set up its wave test site at Billia Crew, and the first wave energy was exported to the grid in 2004, so that was over a short period of 3 years, which is quite remarkable really. The following year, the Fall of Warness tidal test site at Ede, sorry if I mispronounce things, was set up, with the first tidal energy exported to the grid in 2006. In both instances, the achievement of both the wave and tidal test sites cannot be underestimated. Both were world firsts, and EMEC continues to enable the testing of prototypes as well as commercial devices to connect to the grid. And we in NatureScot have long been a supporter of these test facilities, working with both EMEC and the Scottish Government to minimise environmental impacts and maximise technological ambition. In addition to the EMEC test sites, there are other commercial tidal stream developments, such as the operational Maygen site in the Inner Sound in the Pentland Firth, and the proposed orbital schemes in waters adjacent to the Fall of Warness site. So you may have seen the orbital device out at Fall of Warness. It looks like the yellow submarine, and every time I see it, I want to break out into song, but luckily not today. So to the north, in Shetland, the NOVA have been operating in Blue Mull Sound, a tidal stream array, and all of these mean that Scotland has the largest export capacity from tidal stream, as well as the greatest understanding of technological and environmental issues associated with tidal stream energy production in the world, which is really good accolade. More recently, offshore wind has come to Orkney waters, with 2 large-scale commercial projects proposed, west of Orkney, to the west, and Ayr offshore wind farm to the east. Additionally, a smaller demonstration scheme in the Pentland Firth has recently been consented and will be built out soon. When built, these 3 developments will provide 3.1 gigawatts of electricity. And to put that into context, that is 1 gigawatt greater than Longannet, the coal-powered power station that used to operate on the Firth of Forth, produced, and that was Scotland's largest coal-generating power station, and that was the main means of electricity production in Scotland other than hydro. The siting, design and operation of these renewable schemes can cause environmental harm as well as opportunity. Some species can be vulnerable to renewable schemes, and this can depend on the use of foraging areas and their behaviour and the use of the development area. So what is going in there? Sensitivity to disturbance. For example, seals are quite inquisitive and will go and look at things, whereas red-throated divers will not come near anything if they can avoid it. So you have then both micro and macro avoidance. In terms of collision risk, it's down to each individual species and how manoeuvrable they are to avoid collision. And then there's aspects around habitat specialisation and use of prey resources. So siting of developments in areas that are key for certain species and their habitat specialisation can be really detrimental. However, we're still at the initial stages of monitoring the effects of operational turbines, whether offshore wind or tidal stream. We anticipate that there may also be unintended consequences, such as displacement of fishing activity having an effect on fish productivity elsewhere, or even perhaps an increase in biodiversity in turbine arrays because fishers may no longer be able to fish due to the presence of infrastructure. The ability to consider the future use of our land and seas has to be carefully thought through, and we do have national planning frameworks such as National Planning Framework 4, which largely relates to terrestrial development, and offshore we have the National Marine Plan. But we also have now emerging sectoral and regional marine plans. And the goal of each of these is to manage activities for all parties and to consider environment, economic and social interactions, as well as also identifying opportunities for new jobs or for existing jobs to transition into new areas of work to prolong existing economic activity. So I'll give you some figures about jobs in the sector. In December, Scottish Renewables, so that's the industry body, indicated that there were around 4,200 jobs supported by the renewables industry in Scotland during 2023. And this was almost double that reported of the previous year. So you can see there's an increasing employment opportunity in offshore renewables. And amongst the mix, offshore wind is now the renewable energy technology supporting the most employment. And the benefits of renewables employment are felt threefold. You get direct employment, you get indirect employment, i.e. me. My job is not directly related to offshore wind, but we provide advice, so we're seen as an indirect employment. And then there's induced impact from direct and indirect effects, leading to increased jobs and spending. And whilst there are some caveats around the methods that Scottish Renewables use to determine the number of jobs, renewables can and have led to more employment opportunities. These opportunities are also open to a wider range of ages and experience, whether you're coming in from an oil and gas traditional role or newly graduating from the college, sorry, I can't call it college, the universities in Stromness that are doing courses on renewable energies up here. And that can lead to increased age diversity in island communities where renewable developments are planned. Looking forward, what other additional aspects might come from renewables? There is still a lot of work looking at wave and hydrogen technologies. Each of these would not suffer the same intermittency issues that electricity production of wind or tidal suffer. And tidal stream is limited to areas where there are significant water speeds. And while Scotland has one of the highest wind speeds in Europe, not everywhere is suitable for offshore wind. And we've seen from offshore wind developments elsewhere in the UK, there has been to date a preference for shallower waters. However, those shallow waters are limited, and using technologies learned from oil and gas industry, floating wind is now a proposed solution for the deeper waters of Scotland. We're seeing planning applications for battery storage plants, and there are plans for renewable energy helping in the production of both blue and green hydrogen. And offshore wind is also being used to help decarbonise oil and gas production at platforms where traditionally gas turbines have assisted in the production process. And that's quite key, because actually it's not just about the use of fossil fuels, the actual ability to what's the word? Where you actually bring the oil and gas up from the stores. It's one of the highest actual CO2 emitters in the whole of the UK. So given the changes that have occurred in the last 20 years in wind energy production, the likes of west of Orkney, for offshore turbines producing between 18 to 25 megawatts per turbine. However, this will not be of much use if the energy generated is not able to be transported to where it is required. And as I said earlier, the current grid system was planned in the 1950s. And there's now a requirement to reinforce and upgrade the actual grid infrastructure, as well as consider how pushing the power, and that's my technical term, through the lines is costed and paid for. And that's now of national interest. It's been very much left to Scotland to argue this for a long time, but it's now been seen we need to get this right for the future. And to do that, the UK Energy Act, which came into force last year, has formalised that the previous National Grid Organisation move away from working solely on managing the electricity grid infrastructure, and I see I've taken a bit longer than I thought. So the National Grid are moving away from working solely on managing the electricity grid infrastructure, but actually will now start to plan at national and regional level where energy should not just be pushed, but where it should be generated and how it should be transported and stored. And the regional plans in Scotland will be done in conjunction with both SSE and Scottish Power. And many of you will know that the grid and the opportunity to export power has been a substantial issue in Orkney for years, but approval has recently been given to a new interconnector. So what now for the future? In terms of the environment, we are needing to consider what are the longer term consequences of climate change on species and habitats, and how do we build greater resilience into those populations to take account of mass mortality events, such as that recently experienced by bird flu and the marine mammal strandings. We need to continue with research to fill in critical knowledge gaps, as well as keeping an eye out on identifying future knowledge gaps, whether known or unknown at this stage. We will continue to learn from the deployments that have happened through monitoring during the construction and operational phases. And we also need to consider what happens when the devices become obsolete. Do they get replaced or removed? And what alternative technologies may take their place in the future? In terms of technologies, they're all on different trajectories. Fixed foundation for offshore wind is now seen as a mature industry. We are only beginning with floating offshore wind. The tidal stream devices have evolved from the wacky races in terms of look and energy capture, and preferences now appear to be settling on seabed mounted turbines similar to underwater wind turbines, to devices sitting on the sea surface with turbines suspended below. While some devices have now been operating for over 5 years, tidal stream is still seen as a relatively new industry and still requires a large amount of support. Wave energy, which I've only briefly touched on, has to be designed in a manner that can withstand long-term movements in dynamic, harsh marine conditions. It is still very much at an early stage, with a number of prototypes breaking up and disappearing, as you will know full well in Orkney. And battery storage to help with intermittent issues is helpful. However, it comes with its own issues around the use of finite resources such as lithium. Hydrogen production powered by renewables is also keenly being considered, as well as byproducts. So again, with EMEC, they have been world leading in producing an aviation fuel using hydrogen and CO2 from renewables. And one other aspect I've not touched on is the role of ports and harbours. Obviously, with developments in the sea, there is a need to transport components, provide operational support, as well as consider the fabrication and storage of components either on land adjacent to or in the water adjacent to ports. And in Orkney, you've got proposals for new deep water quays at Hatston, Scapa Flow and at Flotter. So where do we go from here? We need to develop future-proof technologies and consider the advice we provide accounts for climate change dynamics. We need to support a balance of energy mix, both onshore and marine, and find solutions to intermittency. In the marine environment, we need to find win-wins for this shared environment through nature-based solutions. And we also need very much societal engagement on grid infrastructure and that energy mix. So as an archipelago, Orkney has led the way on so much of the innovation around renewables, and continuing this innovation and support into the future will hopefully result in the retention and attraction of a diversity of jobs, promote renewable tourism, we've not mentioned that yet, and to continue to shine a light on green renewable technologies, and possibly it will become the industrial archaeology of the future.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Erica. Are there any questions? You've covered a huge amount of sea and ground there. Any questions? I've got one, and listening to you, you mentioned the knowns and the unknowns. So, from what you're saying, this could be, we could get this right. This could be a great success, or it could go quite spectacularly wrong. My blunt question to you is, what should we be mindful of thinking about the risks ahead? What is your candid assessment of what the key risks are that we need to manage here?
I don't think there's just one. I think there's several. I think it's about that shared responsible use of the marine space and making sure that we're not doing something that then causes a knock-on adverse effect for another. I think we've got a real issue with the changes that are going to come with climate change and what is required in terms of building resilience into species that are already being affected. And there are impacts from renewables on those species, but we need to work out how do we address that? Is it in the same place or is it elsewhere to help them? And I think the third thing is about the technology and making sure there's both the sort of financial support, but also that wider understanding of, are we doing the right thing in the right place for now? Is it a short-term fix? Or are we now causing potential future problems that actually we've put things in the wrong place now that may prevent other technologies in the future that might be more sustainable?
Very good answer, Erica. Yes, at the back. Joe.
Thank you for the really informative overview there. I just wanted to say that it's more of a comment really, but I would be interested on your views as well. So a number of people locally have been involved in the Orkney Marine Plan Advisory Group, helping to develop the marine plan for Orkney waters. And unfortunately there's been a lot of delays with getting this plan out for consultation, and I don't think that's doing any of us any favours. So I don't know if there's people in this room or people listening online, but I would just like to put out a plea that we actually get on with getting this plan sorted out, because it's really pertinent to the discussions we're having today of how Orkney Islands moves on in future and the kind of future it wants to have. But that's just my personal perception of the process, which I have been involved in.
I couldn't agree more, actually, and I mentioned sectoral plan as well for offshore wind. The iterative plan review of that was due out last year, and we're still waiting on it. We've got the regional marine plans, and I'm not clear that we've got a clear policy landscape about how all these plans fit together, and therefore what are the key priorities and objectives to go forward. And I think you're right, until plans are actually finalised and gone out there, people can't actually make up their minds what's needed where and when. And that's speaking as a planner.
A recognised planner, yes. Well, that's something we can be mindful of in any publicity we put out from this meeting. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm thinking, like, because there's a lot going on in terms of the, factors influencing, or impacting, as you said, that it's all good renewable energy and whatnot, but it's affecting the marine life. It's maybe affecting the land life and the offshore life, right? So, do you have any thoughts on what if we could create a digital twin of the factors that are influencing, the species offshore and on land? And do you think there's scope we could kind of predict? Because I don't know the extent of knowledge and analysis that we already have. And if we've got that information, maybe using AI-based solutions as well and 3D visualizations, we could kind of predict.
So it's a really good question, and actually at the moment, because we don't have that much information and knowledge from post-consent, once things are built and operating, a lot of the tools and techniques we're using to assess impacts are modelling. It's not actually, it is just all models, and models are only as good as the information you put in. And so as we learn more from the post-consent work, what's happening actually live on site, we feed that back into the models to help improve future decision making. So it is kind of happening, but I'm pretty sure technology and the immediacy of how well that's improving all the time, that will come into play and will help going forward.
Any more questions? Nope. I think we'll close at that. Erica, can we thank you? Thank you very much. Thank you, Erica. So that brings us to the end. Before I hand over to Chris, just to say a few words by way of conclusion, because this is the first part. We've got tomorrow, and I can promise you one thing tomorrow. This room will be cooler tomorrow, so I can promise you that. But before I hand over to Chris, I just want to thank Kate and Becky in particular, who have been looking after us today. They've done a brilliant job in looking after the arrangements. A huge amount of work goes into all the planning, and they've been supported by a team. So I'd like you to join me in thanking them, actually. And I want to thank our speakers. We've been incredibly fortunate. These have been deeply interesting presentations, and it's covered a great diversity of subjects. So there will be people here who I suspect have not been exposed to some of the issues before, and that's very much what Chris and I intended in working up that programme. So please join me in thanking the speakers as well. And at that I will stop and just ask Chris to say a few words.
Oh, careful. Very kind of you, Des. What can I say? I think what I've enjoyed about this afternoon actually is the way in which the speakers have all connected directly or indirectly with some of the issues we've been raising in previous symposia. I think that's the most important thing, and for Des and I, it's a bit selfish, but it's great that all of this is coming together, and I'm hoping that not only can we draw things together tomorrow at the end of tomorrow's session, but that maybe we'll write up something about this series as a whole, because it's been significant. I think it's clearly important what we've been talking about today, and when we met on Skye in Stornoway. So I'm repeating Des in a way. I mean, I think the papers have all been hugely rigorous and always relevant, and you might argue that, and always looking forward as well on the basis of the evidence we have today. And I'm a history man. I don't often look forward. I'm not paid to look forward, but it is really interesting so to do, and to feel part of that forward-looking, using the past really and the present for the future. I think that's important, and that's has come over this afternoon. The other thing that's come over to me, and it's again. I think, important, and that is the comparative stuff. You know, the idea that we're not just in Orkney here, we're not on Skye. There are Scottish islands we can compare and contrast with, but there are islands all over the world we should be comparing and contrasting with and learning from, just as they can. This is an international, a global issue, if you like, islands. So that's good. I think that's been great as well. So I think I won't say more because I'll start havering, and I shouldn't be doing that with such a distinguished audience. I do want to thank everybody here for coming and for your questions, which I think have been illuminating as well, helpful. They've all drawn out something which was embedded in the papers, if you like, but needed to be drawn out. And then, so thank you for all of that. Thank you as an audience for being here. Thanks for those questions. I hope you'll come back tomorrow because we have another interesting, fascinating looking session in the morning. It starts at 9 o'clock. Reminder to myself to learn how to, because this morning I tried to set up my phone an alarm, but it didn't go off. And so I had my breakfast this afternoon. Sitting at the front there, but I was listening intently to all the speakers. So, thanks very much, everybody. See you tomorrow, and let's have a round of applause for all of us here. Yeah.